We are live. What's up? Let's see. As usual, let me take care of a couple things real quick. And let's see what our illustrious rulers have for us today. There it is. I was just kind of chilling. I saw this pop up, and I decided, hell, why not? Let's watch. It's supposed to start at 10. There we go.
From Kentucky, Mr. Massey, to lead us all in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all. Appreciate the enthusiasm. We'll start with opening statements.
What's up, Damien?
To our witnesses.
Good morning, brother.
Himself for an opening
statement. Well, it was good morning until we started watching this. Let's put it that way.
Was colluding with big tech to censor Americans. That's the first thing we learned. But now it's big government colluding with big banks and big business to spy on everything Americans buy, every place they go, everything they do. Big government wants your financial data because it's full of sensitive information about you. Our investigation started when an FBI whistleblower, George Hill, came forward and talked to the committee. Mr. Hill was supervisory intelligence analyst at the FBI up in the Boston field office, told the committee that the FBI got information from Bank of America. Specifically, it received a list of any customer.
It's another one of those things. I was going to watch this, just saw it coming on, decided to share the headache with everybody else.
2021. The whistleblower supervisor, special agent in charge of the Boston field office, Mr. Bonavolanta, corroborated Mr. Hill's testimony when he spoke to the committee. And so did Steve Jensen, the FBI's domestic terrorism operations section chief. But it wasn't just purchase data around a specific date that the FBI got from Bank of America. That was actually also overlaid with any firearm purchase at any time. And how did the FBI get this information? They asked for it. In fact, you can see on the display on the screen here the email that was sent. The FBI told Bank of America, to recap our morning call, we are prepared to action immediately the following threshold: customers confirmed as transacting business in Washington, D.C. between these specific dates. So if you're in Washington, D.C., visiting your kids, maybe visiting your aunt, or maybe just a friend, the FBI wanted to know about every single purchase you made. And if you're a gun owner, look out, you're going to the top of the list. For simply exercising your Second Amendment right, you're on the FBI's target list. Never forget, the federal government got this information without any process. No warrant, and frankly, no notification. The bank didn't tell the customer that we're handing this information over to the FBI, the most powerful law enforcement agency in the world. Now, these FBI agents, Mr. Hill, Mr. Bonavolanta, Mr. Jensen, they all said this was wrong and, in fact, sent the information back to FBI headquarters in D.C. So that's how our investigation began. But since then, and we continue to investigate, but since then, we've learned that the financial surveillance was broader and there was actually a specific objective. Federal government is building
always
profiles.
Nice to know our government spies on us so damn much.
And the profile isn't based on criminal conduct. It's based on political beliefs. And if you got the wrong political beliefs, well, you're potentially a domestic violent extremist. Now, how are they actually doing this? What are the mechanics of this? There's this entity we've discovered called the Domestic Security Alliance Council. Kind of Orwellian in sound and title. The DSAC And this is an entity where the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, works with 650 of the largest companies in the world. These companies have to do over $1 billion in revenue a year. They represent 2/3 of the gross domestic product of the United States economy. And they work through this controlled access portal. We'll put that on the screen here. What are they sharing in this secret portal? Well, we're not exactly sure because it's secret. But we do know that they share some information, share reports. And one of the reports we got, called a liaison information report, said this: any American who opposes firearm legislation, the easing of immigration restrictions, and COVID mandates is someone banks should be watching, because again, they might be an extremist. Now stop and think about that for a
bank ought
second.
to be all up my ass then.
I mean, just in other words, if you're against gun registration, you're for a secured border, you oppose lockdowns and vaccine mandates, you're a domestic violent extremist, according to the FBI.
Hi.
And the government should get your data, should get your financial data.
On today's meeting of
the federal government and banks
violent
also use what they call merchant category codes to
let's
flag
watch our
Americans that
government
shop
tell us
at
how bad they're
places
screwing
like
us.
Bass Pro Shop and Cabela's. They flagged Americans who bought religious text. We can show you that one too. Because everybody knows if you want a secure border and you oppose COVID lockdowns, then you probably shop at Bass Pro Shops and you read your Bible. And of course, all that makes you an extremist. Literally, that is the logic that you see displayed from the information we've been able to gather thus far in our investigation. Now remember, these are also the same folks who just a couple years ago told us if you're a parent showing up at a school board meeting, you're a terrorist. If you're a pro-life Catholic, you're an extremist. Now, of course, if you oppose lockdowns, vaccine mandates, want a secure border, don't want gun registration, you're in that category as well. This is scary where things are headed. We've seen the censorship. Now we see what's happening with big banks and big government relative to your financial data. Again, all this being done with no process, no warrant, no notification to the customer that the banks are actually supposed to serve. Big government's not supposed to use big tech to censor Americans, and big government shouldn't be working with big banks to target Americans for behavior that
I
is
bet
legal
you Jerry
and
Nadler's opening
constitutional.
statement of this one's going to be.
That's the concern. That's why we're having this hearing. We'll get to our guest here in a second. But with that, I would yield to the ranking member for an opening statement before we get to our witnesses.
No, I thought it would have been Nadler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning
She'll
to
be just
everyone
as
that's here
fucking retarded.
at this hearing. I'm glad that the chairman opened with who instigated this hearing, which is George Hill, and what the purpose of this hearing is. At the end of the day, the purpose of this hearing is to minimize what happened on January 6th and the lawful prosecution of individuals who were engaged in that practice.
She has Xanax before this. Normally she's a little bit more
people are being persecuted for their political conduct rather than their criminal behavior. So basically, he's trying to tell us that everyone who's been indicted and prosecuted for January 6th did not engage in criminal conduct.
The vast majority of them didn't.
That's the logic of what he's saying, and it's
the overwhelming majority of them.
We've just come so low in this house. It's just frightening to me what people will do to try and minimize the work.
I guarantee you, she hasn't read the charging documents for a lot of people on January 6th. I have.
This entire Republican conspiracy theory was launched based on the testimony of a so-called whistleblower, George Hill, who appeared for a transcribed interview last year. Mr. Hill claimed that the
BLM
FBI
came
was
up,
using the Bank of America.
Drones were flying over there.
All
protests,
Americans,
or
not all Americans.
Some of them were being
everyone who
monitored.
owns a firearm, as the chairman said.
This chick was
not
losing her
everyone
mind.
who owns a firearm.
Fluffy, what's up, my brother?
Of language within an entire report is just inappropriate information giving to the American people. Give them all of it so that they can see the true picture.
Warsaw, what's up, my
Tell
brother?
half a story, you're not telling the
I
truth.
missed Bishop this morning, man. I
The
got hung up
FBI
doing some
asked the
stuff.
Bank of America for information on individuals who fit 3 categories. People who came, that there is evidence that they were here on January 6th, that they purchased a firearm in the last 6 months, and, that's key, and, not or, and they plan to come back for the inauguration. And they know that they were coming back for the inauguration based on Airbnb purchases, hotel, RSVPs in the DMV area. And they were individuals who had come on January 6th and know that through those purchases as well. And these were not all of the people that they were looking at, but what was the
what's up, my brother?
Purpose of this? It was to make sure that a January 6th event didn't happen on inauguration because people were talking about it.
You know, I'd have to find it. I saw one video of a dude that had a gun on January 6th.
I'm going to tell you that.
Out in the open.
It's domestic terrorists.
As far as I know, he hadn't been arrested.
Individuals engaged in domestic violence. That happens.
It's funny how that works.
When it's people who fit your political agenda, they're not criminals anymore. They're patriots. They're victims. They're not. They're criminals. And a jury of their peers found that when so many of them have been prosecuted in our court of law. Not by brown shirts.
Most of them have pled out because you guys threatened to absolutely
not by Biden's
ruin their
Justice
lives.
Department.
And then offered them a deal to where they might get some of their life
And it's
back.
surprising that we don't have George Hill here today, because in the same way that their star witness on their impeachment, Alexander Smirnov, remember him, who was their key witness in the Hunter Biden impeachment probe, until we found out that everything he said was made up and he actually got his information from
Warsaw,
Russia.
100%, man.
We don't know what's going to happen.
Got to figure out which district Alabama was in.
We can pretty well guess based on the track record. I want to thank our witnesses for being here. We don't always agree on things that witnesses say, but we thank them for their willingness to come and give their thoughts and be questioned by members of Congress here and of this hearing. I particularly want to thank Mr. Fanon for being here with us today. I want to thank him publicly for his bravery and his willingness in sharing his traumatic, harrowing experience so publicly so that we can understand and so that there can be truth juxtaposed to falsehoods. I'm sorry for you
would not know the truth of it.
all the men and women who fought on the front lines, just steps away from this room that we are in today, to protect all of us in this building, from staff, from the architects of the Capitol, to members of Congress, to the young people who are here. My experience here today is nothing.
Yeah, those cops did a great job. They shot an unarmed woman right in the neck.
And Mr. Fanon, while those of us on the dais were being protected in insecure locations, some of us fearing for our lives, many of us on both sides of the aisle fearing for their life on that day that they've quickly forgotten about after visits to Mar-a-Lago. I want to thank you because you saw it all, because you were out there. You didn't hide, you ran towards danger. You went out.
One of the ones that opened the door and let people walk in?
You and your brothers and sisters in blue went out and did that. And I wanted to share just a reminder of what really occurred on that day.
Yeah, 500.
You guys fight the right people.
Are they going to show videos of the police actually escalating it and instigating shit? No, they're not going to show that. They'll show when people reacted to the police, but they won't show the police pepper spraying people for no reason, shooting people in the face with rubber fucking bullets.
Clear medic! We need EMTs now!
Mike, stay in there, buddy. Mike, it's Jimmy. I'm here. Mike.
They also won't show
That's a battle scene.
that when protesters did jump on one
That's
cop,
what that
there
is.
were
That's
other
a battle
protesters who
scene.
stopped them and drug
That
the
is
cop
not
out of there
political
to
discord.
save him.
That's criminal
What's up, Sam?
behavior.
How's it going, my brother?
That's what that is. And while Capitol police officers were slipping in blood on the ground as they fought their fellow officers' fight in that
They were
insurrection,
slipping in the blood of protesters.
those of us who were in the Capitol, those members of Congress and staff were seeking shelter.
No, man, we live in
And
complete clown
unfortunately,
world 500. It's not justice anymore.
Mr.
It hasn't been
Fanon,
for a long
you have
time.
met the times that we are in. You have given up your safety to secure truth. Unfortunately, many of my colleagues on the other side know the truth, but they're still seeking shelter from Donald Trump's hordes. They're still seeking shelter
That's why
from the truth.
people wanted to
They
hide
want to
and
protect
ignore
not
the
just
footage from
themselves,
Kansas.
but their political careers.
Yeah,
Their
that's what I was saying
jobs.
earlier. Yeah, they flat out murdered
They're
him.
hiding behind lies for that.
I've seen that video from 2 or 3
We
different
know what
angles. I
happened,
am
not just by those
amazed
videos and footage,
that bullet,
but
when
the
it went
nearly
through her, didn't
1,000
hit the 2
convictions
cops that were off
obtained
to her
against
right.
those rioters
Because there were 2
across
cops,
an array
2 or 3
of
cops standing right
jurisdictions.
there,
Conviction from career prosecutors,
right next to her.
not political hacks, with juries of the defendants' peers.
She went up on the
Everyday
window way, or
Americans
up on the window,
saw
it was
the
busted out,
evidence.
went and stepped through, dude stepped
Evidence
up,
that
shot
has
her
been
right in the neck.
obtained by prosecutors and investigators have worked to hold these violent individuals
Her
accountable.
being a little
for
bit
their
elevated was
horrendous deeds.
probably the only thing that kept that bullet
So,
from hitting the
I got a
police
lot of
officer
else
she was just
that I could have
standing next
talked
to.
about. But I guess we'll get to it.
And I watched all of that shit
The
live.
lady yields
that day.
back. Without objection, all of their opening statements will be included in the record. We now introduce today's witnesses. Dr. Jordan Peterson is a psychologist, author, and professor
Oh, hell,
emeritus at
Jordan
the University
Peterson?
of Toronto.
Fuck yeah.
He previously taught at Harvard University and McGill University. He has published more than 100 scientific
This
papers,
hearing just
hosted
got way
popular
better.
podcasts, hosts public lectures across the United States, Canada, Australia, and Europe, and offers online programs to help consumers better understand their personalities and themselves. Dr. Peterson has been targeted for his views on the importance of free speech and traditional values, and has warned of the dangers of debanking political opponents as he is seen in Canada. Mr. Brian Knight is Director of Innovation and Governance at the Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center. He has research published widely on financial regulation, including the creation of pro-innovation regulatory environments, the role of regulation for credit markets and consumer protection, and the sharing of data between financial institutions, their regulators, and other federal entities. Mr. Jeremy Tedesco serves as Senior Counsel at and the Senior Vice President of Corporate Engagement at the Alliance Defending Freedom. In these roles, he
night,
works
that's
to
another
advance free
man. I was
speech,
watching
religious freedom, and
live
human
streams
dignity
that
in
night.
companies. He
I
also
didn't
works
see
to
him
prevent political and religious debanking at major financial institutions.
live.
I actually believe
I
the
had to go
Alliance
back and
Defending
watch.
Freedom is
I
one
was
of the
just getting into
one of
the
the
shower.
entities targeted
still
by
had
the
the
government
live
in
streams
some of these
playing where I could hear
correspondence. So
them
we appreciate you
and
being here
heard
as well.
shots and had
Mr.
to go
Norbert
back
Michael
and look
is
and
Vice
watch
President
the
Director
footage
of the
that night.
Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives at the Cato Institute. He has researched and published on issues pertaining to financial markets
Pretty
and
much
monetary
all I was
policy,
doing
including
for
the Bank
months
Secrecy Act.
was watching
Important piece of
all these
legislation for
different
the
live
exchange,
streams
and
of these
particularly he has
riots
advocated for
going on
reforms that
and
advance
shit getting
individuals'
burnt
rights
down
against
and
government overreach and
cops
protecting
letting
personal
them
financial
just
privacy.
go
Mr. Michael Fanone
burn
is a law
police
enforcement
stations down,
analyst,
set
security consultant, and
courthouses on
firearms
fire.
instructor. He previously served for 20 years as a police officer with the DC Metropolitan Police Department. We welcome our witnesses and thank them for appearing today. We'll begin by swearing you in. Would you please
Similar
rise and
words.
raise your right hand? Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God? Let the record show that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. Thank you. You may be seated. Please know that your written testimony will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, we ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. We'll be a little lenient on the time, so if you go a little over, that's fine. If you go too far over, we may have to just move on to the next, but many of you have done this before, so you know how this works. There's a microphone. We'd ask that you turn that on when you're testifying. And we will start with Dr. Peterson. Mr. Peterson, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you again for being here.
Yes, well, I would like to start by expressing my appreciation for the privilege awarded to me to testify here today. It really is an honor to be asked to do so. I'm not here to talk about January 6th or about any particular threat, insurrection, or protest, political or ideological, real or imaginary. I'm here to talk about the already extant and expanding collusion of government and corporation in restricting the individual freedom and autonomy upon which the productive, generous, and stable psyche, economy, and state are themselves necessarily founded. I'll begin my comments, therefore, in the most general terms to shed light on the mounting problem. There are now 700 million CCTVs in China under the rule of the Communist Party. The system to which those electronic eyes are attached is the most complete state apparatus of surveillance yet imagined, with the ability not only to recognize faces at a distance, but gait itself when facial features are hidden or obscured.
No, we're doing
Such
good, Sam.
capability
Thanks for asking, brother.
can
What you
and
always do.
will soon be
Hopefully
augmented
you're
to
doing
the
good,
point
man.
where the movement of eyes themselves, monitored by high resolution and intelligent cameras, will soon be sufficient to identify any aware and active party. The demented, naive, and prideful engineers who so enthusiastically helped build this system call it Skynet, after the rogue and all-seeing technology that took such a dreadfully wrong turn in the famous science fiction movie Terminator series, featuring artificially intelligent robot intelligences hell-bent on protecting themselves by destroying humanity. The name also references a well-known Chinese phrase describing the reach of the divine itself. The net of heaven is vast, yet it misses nothing, which aptly describes the capabilities of the new state apparatus. The system is integrated with the so-called Chinese social credit system, which awards its involuntary participants with a score indicating their compliance with the dictates of the Chinese Communist Party, allowing for full control over access to everything they possess electronically, most ominously their savings and their access to travel, certainly all modern means of travel, but increasingly as the electronic gates come up, even by walking. If you're Chinese or a visitor, your access to the world can be reduced to zero if your social credit score falls beyond an arbitrary minimum.
My plan is to keep my social credit score
allows you purposefully to be shut out of all activities that can be virtualized. And in a rapidly virtualizing world, this increasingly means all activities: driving, shopping, working, eating, finding shelter, even fraternizing with friends and family, as merely being in the presence of someone with a low social credit score means that your own score can be lowered. This has also opened up the opportunity for the government to extract slave-like labor from its citizens, so burdened, as the donation of free work to the state still constitute one means by which erring Chinese men and women can increase their score and remain part of human society.
Well, our government wants to go in that same direction.
Precisely the payment system most desired by the most tyrannical, not the work for me and benefit thereby that constitutes the contractual arrangement undertaken by free and sovereign citizens, but the work for me and I will lift the deprivation I imposed. It has always been the leitmotif of the slaver. Why is any of this relevant to people in the West? Well, because the technology that the Chinese Communist Party employs is an extension of Western technology. Because we already fell prey to the terrible temptation of lockdown employed by that state in the face of hypothetical crisis once and in the very recent past, because we're walking step by step in the same direction, partly because of the hypothetical convenience of universal and automatic recognition of identity, and partly because any problem whatsoever that now confronts us can easily be used to justify the increasing reach of the security and nanny state.
I need to get
It is
some
said
just
that
to
Stone
run
Age
some.
people, first confronted with cameras and their resultant photographs by modern anthropologists, objected to having their images captured as they feared the captivity of their
That's
souls.
about all I've ever run is
It turns
30s.
out that such fear was prescient. The images that we leave behind while navigating virtual space are such close duplicates of our actual selves that the capture of our essence is at this point all but guaranteed. We all now have our doppelgangers. We all live so much in the virtual world.
That's why if I want
consequence
anything
of our
more than
purchasing habits
30
and
rounds
modes of
hanging on my gun,
electronically
I've got a
mediated
couple mags.
communication, that our very selves have become reducible to
Drop
a
pop,
frightening
man. Drop.
degree to
Swap it
data,
over.
the modern
What's up,
equivalent
brother
of our
DB? How's
footprint,
it going?
with the same data making up an image of our identity. An identity which can be and is
Fluffy, you're
increasingly
right.
bought and sold by the invisible
Need to
corporate
put some more
brokers
tape on the bottom.
that still mostly use it to sell us what we so desperately and carelessly and conveniently want, but can also be used to track, monitor, and
About it,
punish
man. We work,
everything
pay
we do and
taxes.
say. Behavioral scientists facilitate this process with their
If you don't pay your
reprehensible
taxes, the
nudging,
government will
the
strip you
practice
of all
of
your
pushing
property and
people
throw your
in a
ass in
given
prison.
ideologically determined
Unless your
direction
name's
by
provided.
manipulating invisible incentives behind the scene. Corporations track purchasing decisions, developing algorithms that with increasing accuracy track our patterns of attention and
Nah,
action,
man, those pro
allowing
mags
for
are
the prediction of what
horrible.
might next be most enticing. Doing so not
Especially
only to
their AK
offer us what
mags.
we want, but to determine
Horrible.
and shape what we need. Governments can and are colluding with these corporate agents to develop a picture not only of our actions, but of our thoughts and words, so that deviation from the desired end can be mapped,
When it
rewarded, and
comes down
punished.
to it, which I've
The
got
development of a digital identity and currency is
mag
nothing more
pull
than the
mag,
likely end
and then just a
consequence of such
standard
inclinations.
metal
And the combination of both
snag
can and
mag.
will facilitate the
And both of
development of a
those things
surveillance
run
state,
beautiful.
the scope of which
those pro
optimistic
mags are
pessimists of
absolute
totalitarianism
garbage.
such as George Orwell could scarcely imagine. The new AI systems, which are so rapidly emerging, do nothing but increase this danger, providing for the possibility of a super surveillance whose scope exceeds anything that mere unaugmented humans could imagine, while also making it certain that even the perceptions that in the real world shape our attitudes, conduct, and personality can be manipulated to the degree that we will not even be able to see a reality outside which that has been constructed by the superstate. The ultimate fascist collusion between gigantic self-interested corporations and paranoid security-obsessed anti-human governments. We're already selling our souls to the superstate for the purposes of immediate gratification, while
Yeah, all
being
my
enticed to
mag
do
mags
so
run
by
far.
Mr. Chairman,
fear-mongering
could the
ideologues.
witness be asked to summarize, please?
Aren't you rude bastard?
Well, do I have my 5 minutes or do I not?
You've gone over 5
Oh,
minutes.
I'm sorry. I can certainly. I can
If the
certainly
witness could
complete
summarize,
that.
we're always a little lenient with the time. If you could
I'll
summarize. in a
take
few
10 more
seconds.
seconds.
Sure.
With increasing ability to monitor not only the actual attention patterns and behaviors of its citizens, but to predict those that are most likely, the persecution of even potential crime becomes ever more likely. If you have nothing to hide, you will have nothing to fear, will be the slogan commandeered by those most likely to turn to surveillance to protect and
They
control.
already talk like that.
What was the famous Soviet totalitarian joke attributed to Lavrenti Beria, head of the secret police? Show me the man and I'll show you the crime. Those words were true enough in the time of Stalin's KGB, and the police were secret enough then as well. But that's nothing compared to what we can and likely will produce now. A police so secret that we will not even be able to detect their comprehensive and subtle activity. Monitoring crime so pervasive that everyone under the dictates of the system will have something to hide
Regular
and
order,
much to
Mr.
fear.
Chairman.
Yep. The gentleman's time is expired. We now go to Mr. Knight for your statement.
Boy, they really don't like Jordan Peterson.
Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Plaskett.
I
members of the
understand he was
subcommittee.
going over, but
It's an honor to be
it
asked to
didn't feel like
testify.
5 minutes to me.
My name is Brian Knight, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, where my research focuses on financial regulation, including its use as a tool of broader policy. Americans write the story of their lives in their bank accounts. To function in a modern economy, Americans must create a trail of records that can reveal their movements, their religious and political beliefs, their sexual preferences, health conditions, whether they are likely to own a gun or have had an abortion. The government can access these records without meaningful due process or the person ever knowing it happened. It's perhaps unsurprising then that efforts to expand the use of financial surveillance are increasing. While potentially well-meaning, these efforts present a pressing threat to Americans' privacy and a glaring weakness in our constitutional order that should be addressed. A recent example of this is federal law enforcement and financial institutions collaborating to share financial records of an unknown number of Americans after January 6th. While publicly available information is limited, it appears this was done to identify suspects based on their movement, political and religious beliefs, and whether they owned a firearm. These searches use broad categories, many of which relate to lawful, sensitive, and constitutionally protected
Yes,
activity.
Fluffy,
This was
absolutely.
apparently
They do.
done under the Bank Secrecy Act, which allowed the information to be provided without a
Says-
warrant or any
That's
outside
why they
check,
tried to shut, well,
and
they
prevented
did
the
shut
targets
down
of the
people's
search
YouTube
from being
channels,
told it happened.
shut them down
We
on
only
any
know it
social media, ban them
occurred
from
because of the
Facebook,
testimony
ban
of
them from
whistleblowers in the work
Twitter
of
at
the
the time,
subcommittee.
now X.
We do not know how often similar techniques were used in the past and if their use is
That's why
currently
these
ongoing.
dickheads up here, some of
Add
these in
insult to
this
injury, it's
room
unclear that the data was even
wrote
used
letters about
and was removed by the
people
FBI.
doing videos about
only
guns
after
on
it had been
YouTube
shared
and
with at
got
least 2
them
field
fucking
offices.
banned.
Now, it isn't surprising that after a serious
Marine
crime,
Gun Builder is a
fearing more
perfect
violence,
example of that.
that law
P.A.D.
enforcement would
Ralph
use
was
every
another
tool available.
example of that.
However, the way
Um,
this appears to have happened is emblematic of the
just
serious defects in our protection of
absolute
Americans'
insanity.
privacy enabled by financial surveillance. Sadly, this isn't the only recent example of the expansive use of financial surveillance. There are currently efforts to distort the financial system to turn it into a tool to track constitutionally protected behavior, including firearms purchases. Advocates of this approach argue it will help prevent violence, especially mass shootings. To be sure, this is a noble aspiration. However, it is unlikely the effort will accomplish its goal while imposing
Chessboard, what's
significant
up, my
costs to
brother?
privacy, trust, and the ability of our anti-money laundering system to fulfill its legitimate
Yeah,
goals,
chessboard,
as well as
you know me, I
encouraging
got to
a
share.
broader escalation of surveillance.
I'm torturing myself.
As
I
discussed in more
might as well
detail
have a
in my
whole
written
support
testimony,
group with me.
Our problem is that our financial system provides a convenient, almost one-stop shop where without the constitutional protections that apply to similar information elsewhere. It's too easy for the government to obtain a comprehensive and retrospective, though not perfect, picture of a person's life without due process. A further problem is that the Bank Secrecy Act is opaque by design. Banks are prohibited from alerting the target of a report. This prevents most citizens whose information is shared from challenging the law in court.
Think about it. That's part
removing
of how
one of the
CRS
core
got
means
messed
we use
up.
to check government excesses.
It was a bank
Congress has also
employee
been
that
kept in the dark about the effectiveness of the BSA, despite requiring reports revealing the system's effectiveness be provided by law. In fact, a bank apparently even refused to share information with the subcommittee based on the Bank Secrecy Act's confidentiality requirements. It even
yeah,
appears that
there's
the
a bunch of
agencies
you
that
out there
administer
that
the
do show a
BSA
lot
and
of
use the
love and a lot of
BSA
support, brother.
lack a full or even partial picture of how the information is used, how useful it is,
I said
and how
most of
long
my
it takes for
streams
government
basically
to
all
act on it.
giant therapy sessions.
We have these problems due to a combination
ADX,
of
what's up,
technology,
my brother?
bad law, and bad Supreme Court precedent. The latter of which thankfully may be finally coming
We're
under
going to need a
question,
lot of support
but we
tonight
cannot
too,
and
because
should not
Joe
rely on the
Biden's State of
court.
the Unions tonight.
As discussed further in my written testimony, Congress should reform our financial surveillance system,
Rich said
especially
something
the Bank
about
Secrecy
inviting me
Act,
on their
to
stream.
restore
That might
proper
be
protection for
interesting too.
Americans' privacy. Importantly, and I want to emphasize this does not mean that law enforcement could not access the information. Rather, it means that the access would be done pursuant to due process. To be clear, I'm not here to impugn anyone's motives, but good intentions can pave the road to hell. And our history is unfortunately replete with times when, motivated by real threats, we have violated the rights of Americans, often without benefit, and to our later regret. We should learn from those mistakes and get off the path I fear we're currently taking, which will provide us with neither liberty nor security. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Knight. Mr. Tedesco, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Plaskett.
Dude, it
distinguished
would be
members of the
fun to
Select
throw together
Subcommittee,
bingo
good morning.
cards
It's an
for
honor
his
to be here.
State
My
of the
name is
Union.
Jeremy Tedesco, and I serve as Senior Counsel and Senior Vice President of Corporate Engagement for Alliance Defending Freedom. Yesterday, this subcommittee released documents that show that the U.S. Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network.
Of course, I'd be willing to bet if
colluded
we
with
took
big
a
banks to
drink every
monitor
time
their
he mentions
customers to
MAGA
identify
tonight,
domestic
we're
threats,
all going to have
and shared a list
alcohol
of
poisoning
so-called
within
hate
the first
groups
20 minutes.
published by the hyperpartisan Institute for Strategic Dialogue to help them do so.
I already heard he's
Echoing the
supposed to have
discredited and morally bankrupt Southern Poverty Law Center,
a lady
the
there
ISD
suffered
list
from gun
includes
violence
ADF, where I work,
is one of
as
his
well as
guests.
other mainstream
So
religious and
guns
conservative
are going to be
organizations
probably
like
a
Family
bigger
Research
part of the
Council,
speech tonight than
Liberty
they have
Council,
been in the past.
Pacific Justice Institute,
And some
Roof
other
Institute.
things just ridiculous.
Simply put, the federal government appears to have swept up Christian and conservative organizations in its domestic terrorist dragnet. This Orwellian surveillance of American citizens has no place in a free society. Neither does the federal government's weaponization of the financial industry against
They are.
peaceful
What's up, my
religious and
brother?
conservative groups. Our story is just one of many,
Good morning. Hopefully
demonstrating
you got
the
some coffee
increased
on you already.
rise and threat of viewpoint-based debanking. In 2023, Bank of America closed the long-standing bank account of Indigenous Advance Ministries, a Christian nonprofit that helps impoverished widows and children in Uganda. The bank also closed the account of a local Tennessee church that donates to that ministry. The bank claimed it no longer wanted to serve their business type and that Indigenous Advance exceeded the bank's risk tolerance. The bank's abrupt decision created a
Yeah, well, you
logistical
can see
nightmare
this
for
stuff working
Indigenous
out for
Advance
China in
and
real
inflicted
time.
real harm on the populations they serve. The list goes on. JP Morgan Chase debanked the Arkansas Family Council for being high risk and never provided a
That's
credible
good,
reason
Sam. I
for
need to
canceling
slow
the
down
account
on
of former
mine.
U.S. Senator Samuel Brownback's
Then
organization,
I
the
watch
National
stuff and then
Committee
I
for Religious
feel
Freedom.
like I have to.
And Wells Fargo denied payment processing to the pro-life group, the Ruth Institute, because it was a hate group. These debanking stories and many more highlight the systemic risk of political
Hey, look
and
at all the
religious
people
bias
PayPal
that
shut
pervades
down.
the financial industry, particularly at the largest banks and payment processors.
Look at all the people
These institutions maintain
GoFundMe shut
reputational
down.
risk policies that allow them unfettered discretion to punish customers who have, in their view, problematic political or religious views. Many also have prohibitions on hate speech and intolerance that require the institution to make subjective and value-based judgments on a customer's viewpoint. Both types of policies are vague and ambiguous, sweep in broad swaths of content, chill constitutionally protected speech, and erode economic freedom. Worse, government regulators can all too easily wield their outsized power over financial institutions.
Why do
to
you
pressure
think our
them to
government wants
leverage
to go to a
reputational risk
cashless
policies, hate
society?
speech policies, and similarly vague language against disfavored views, all with virtually no public accountability. Financial institutions, in turn, can hide behind that same shield to discriminate without ever explaining it to the customer, regardless of whether the action was prompted by government pressure. There is ample evidence of the two collaborating to censor views they don't like, whether it was the DOJ and FDIC in Operation Choke Point, the state of New York and NRA versus Vulo, a case currently pending before the Supreme Court, or the FBI and Treasury and recent revelations from this subcommittee. Each of these incidents show that the government can and will weaponize the financial marketplace against Americans for political benefit.
Yeah, cash
Several
out too.
factors exacerbate this risk. Banking regulators have expansive authority over banks' day-to-day operations and decisions. Both the government and banks have shown an
And we know
unsettling
the
willingness
shit
to
going
increase
on with
data collection
CRS's
practices
wife right now.
around customers' speech and religious
Her trying to keep
exercise.
their business up
In
and
most
going.
banking supervision,
A lot of this
shrouded
came
in
from
secrecy.
members of Congress
The government
writing
props up
letters and
many of
making
these
phone
institutions
calls.
with bailouts, subsidies, and an
Along with news
anti-competitive
outlets.
chartering system. Due in part to these benefits, the top 5 banks control over 50% of the market for deposit accounts. This only elevates the need to ensure viewpoint neutrality in the provision of financial services. Congress should take action. This is an issue that we should all agree on and deserves our utmost attention. We cannot continue to let law enforcement, regulators, and banks that are too big to fail run roughshod over our First Amendment freedoms. I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Tedesco. Mr. Michel, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Plaskett, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing. I'm Norbert Michel, Vice President and Director for Cato's Center for Monetary and Financial Alternatives, and the views that I express today in this testimony are mine. They should not be construed as representing any official position of the Cato Institute. In my testimony, I argue that it is long past the time for Congress to reaffirm Americans' constitutional rights that guarantee an expectation of privacy.
That's the reason that they want that
particularly those secured by
cashless
the Fourth
society.
Amendment.
Go to a full digital currency.
Excuse me. The Bank Secrecy Act and the anti-money laundering framework that
Then,
the government
oh
has
man,
developed around it
don't
are
you dare
unnecessary,
say anything
wasteful,
about
and
them
harmful.
transmissions, because
Typical
we'll shut
American
your
is not
entire
a
life
terrorist,
down.
a criminal, or a tax cheat, and does not want to live among such individuals. Typical American does, however, recognize that the Constitution protects all Americans from unreasonable persecution and limitless invasions of privacy. And I'd like to make 3 main points in support of my position. First, Congress should not have passed the Bank Secrecy Act of 1970. It was a much broader bill than the legislation that its original sponsor promised to deliver, and its relationship to the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution was controversial enough to spur several legal challenges 2 of which ended in split decisions at the U.S. Supreme Court during the 1970s. Further, the bill was so controversial that it spurred Congress to pass multiple bills, including the Right to Financial Privacy Act, just 8 years after passing the Bank Secrecy Act. It did so with the explicit intent of countering the very financial surveillance that the Bank Secrecy Act itself created. Unfortunately, the 1978 bill was so watered down with 20 different exceptions that it failed to live up to its name. As a result, financial institutions remain responsible for both record-keeping and reporting requirements, and law enforcement has the authority to obtain Americans' financial records without first obtaining a
Just you
valid
putting
search warrant.
cash into your bank,
So-called third-party doctrine,
making cash
born
deposits.
largely out of those Supreme Court decisions, in
You know,
the
they have to
1970s,
report anything
excuses
10
this legal
grand and
status
over.
by effectively
But even
claiming
if you
that
put
bank
in
customers have no
under 10
expectation
grand,
of privacy from the government
that bank can
once
still
they
report
give
you.
their information to the bank. Much like the dissenting justices of those cases, I believe this logic defies all reasoning. There is simply no sphere of our lives that would remain free of government involvement, surveillance, and control if it were taken seriously. Second, the agencies themselves have failed to demonstrate how the Bank Secrecy Act regime provides a net benefit, and it has merely created an information overload for federal agencies through excessive reporting. In 2022, for instance, financial institutions were required to file over 26 million reports with the federal government on customer activity. And even though it's been decades since the first suspicious
Fluffy, and I wouldn't
report
put
was
that
filed,
past them
the
at
Financial
all.
Crimes Enforcement Network still
Not this
cannot
government.
provide data that explains how law enforcement even uses those reports. These 2 points are just the tip of the iceberg. Difficult as it may be to believe, there are virtually no convictions to show for all this regulating and reporting. Depending on the federal crime data that we use, the per conviction cost ranges anywhere from $7 million to $178 million. And those figures do not include any implicit cost of violating citizens' right to financial privacy, banks' decisions to terminate or limit customers' accounts, or banks' refusal to provide financial services to certain customers. Finally, personal and financial privacy are pillars of life in a free society. The American system of government was designed
we don't
with
have
good reason
privacy
to
anymore. These
ensure
people
that
spy on
individuals
everything we do.
enjoy a private
Dan
sphere,
Voss, what's up,
free
my
of
brother?
government involvement, surveillance, and control. Unless there is a
How's the
reasonable
government supposed to
suspicion
keep
that
me
someone
safe?
has
Yeah.
committed a crime or conspired
For
to
your
commit a
safety.
crime, people should generally be free to live their lives unmolested and unsurveilled by the government. That is literally why the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution protects Americans from unreasonable searches and seizures. And Americans' financial records should not be an exception to that rule. It is, of course, healthy to debate what private companies should be allowed to do with the data they collect from customers. But no American should confuse that debate with why we have the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment protects us from unwarranted government persecution. And that is why Congress should amend the Bank Secrecy Act and restore Americans' Fourth Amendment rights. Thank you. I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Michelle. We now go to Mr. Brown for 5 minutes.
Because, you know, a lot of us aren't using cash as much as we normally did. You know,
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee.
so basically
thank you for
everything that
inviting me
we
here
do
today to answer questions regarding the events that
is
occurred
monitored
in the United States
electronically through
Capitol on
phones.
January 6, 2021.
monitored through our bank accounts.
I would like to tell you that I've forgotten some of the events of that day, or that my recollection is not as clear as it once was. But that would not be the truth.
Yes,
The events
Tess,
of January 6th are as vivid to me now as when they occurred over 3 years
Which I
ago.
wouldn't deliver to
While
New
the
York
physical
any day.
scars of that day have healed, the emotional scars remain. We are a government of laws, not of men. I spent nearly 2 decades as a law enforcement officer trying to enforce the law. My career began in the United States Capitol as a Capitol police officer and ended when
one
called
of the
upon
ones
as
that
a
unlocked
Metropolitan
doors and
Police officer
escorted people into
to
the
protect the
Capitol
Capitol against a mob of people.
and then watch them get arrested?
While much of my career
thrown in
involved
prison
dangerous
and-
encounters with violent criminals, that experience was unlike anything I had experienced. I'm here to tell you what happened to me on that day and what I saw. And
Were you one of the
heard
ones who
happening to fellow
instigated
officers.
the violence?
As for me, I was violently grabbed restrained, beaten,
Matt, what's up, brother?
tased, all while being called a traitor to my country. I was at risk of being stripped of and killed with my own firearm as I heard chants of kill him with his own gun. My body camera video captured the violence of the crowd directed towards me during those
Did
very
your body
brutal
cam
moments.
video
The portions
capture
of the
people
video
yelling
I
at
have
you like
seen
that?
remain
I
extremely
honestly
painful
doubt
for
it.
me to watch. But doing so is crucial to fully understand what really happened that day and the extent of the violence. During those moments, I remember thinking that there was a good chance that I could be killed, and my thoughts were of my children who may lose their father.
Yeah.
While I'm here to share my experience,
100%.
I know that hundreds of other law enforcement officers responded that day. They were outnumbered and acted with tremendous bravery to protect the Capitol and all those present inside who serve our country. Those
Executed
officers
an
have
unarmed
sustained
woman.
injuries, both physical and emotional. They too have been scarred, some visible and some that cannot be seen. I think of them often, like my partner, Jimmy Albright, who dragged me to safety while I was unconscious and who drove me to the emergency room.
Chris,
though
what's up,
injured
brother, man?
himself. I think then
Morning.
about Commander Ramey Kyle, who, like so many of us, self-deployed to the Capitol, who organized the defense of the Lower West Terrace Tunnel. His rally cry, "Do not give up the door," echoes through my thoughts.
Yeah, dude, they got
Think of all the
National
brave men and women,
Guard
newly
in the
minted
subways,
officers,
New
and
York
those
right
nearly
now.
retired who responded to the call of service that day in defense of our nation. Those who are still on the front lines each and every day to make our city safe
You guys
and
weren't
protect our
defending our nation. You were
institutions of
defending the
government.
largest criminal
I
organization
appear
in the
today
world.
not to give my opinion or analysis or advocate for some action, but simply to bear witness. I leave whatever actions to be taken to your wisdom and where we go as a nation to the American people. I have no agenda or affiliation. I do not come with malice in my heart, but only a deep love of this country, which I know is shared by so many others, both young and old, both Republican and Democrat. And in the process of speaking, more importantly, listening to each other, hopefully we can come together as one nation with shared values of
AR,
wanting
I
tomorrow
wouldn't
to be better than
put
today,
that past him at all.
with the hope and confidence that we do each and every day, excuse me, is for the singular purpose of trying to provide a better life for our children and our children's children in generations to come.
Yeah, man.
Thank you for your invitation to be here today and the opportunity to speak with you.
This guy testified in one of the
Thank you, Mr.
hearings. Not
Pamone. We'll now
well,
proceed on the
fucking a
5-minute
year
rule
or
with
so
questions. The chair
ago.
recognizes the gentleman from California.
Hell, maybe
for 5
2
minutes.
at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Pamone, I want to express my heartfelt thank you for being here today. Those of us who were here on January 6th, in no small part owe you and others a debt of gratitude for the work you did, ushering people into, members of Congress and others into safety. And I
Well,
truly
they ushered
appreciate
other
that.
people
Thank
through
you.
the Capitol,
Thank
then
you, sir.
turned around and had them arrested too. There's that.
If this were only about January 6th, that would have been my last comment and we'd be done. I'm going to ask a series of questions that I think beg the question of something
Mike
beyond
McClune, my
January
brother from
6th.
up north. What's up?
For all of you, if you'd raise your hand, are there any of you who think that it would be better if we had the same rules of discovery that China, Cuba, Russia, Iran have from a standpoint of looking for criminals among us? Is there anyone here that would raise their hand? I thought not. For all of you, let's ask some questions, and I'll use Mr. Tedesco as my straw man for a moment. With the way the Bank Secrecy Act has been used, is there anything that stops an administration from choosing to look at and gather, strip away and get from the major banks or all the banks, all the data of all the citizens and participants in our society? In other words, simply haul it all in so they have a database for whatever they need to do, whether it's January 6th or, somebody driving in town.
If I'm your
and
entertainment,
not
Chris,
being
you
a
might
parking
as well
ticket.
get you some
Sure.
Motrin,
I don't know the Bank
um,
Secrecy Act.
a lot of
particularly
aspirin,
well.
anything
I
for
know
a
the
headache.
First Amendment implications of the way in which
I'm
banks
really looking at
regulate.
the Fourth Amendment for a moment.
Sure.
You know, again, for the others,
I
Mr.
don't
Knight,
think I
I
could
think you
trust
answered
myself
on this.
running heavy equipment. And
Really,
watching
there's
some of
nothing
this
that would
stuff. I'd
stop
probably just
an
lose it.
administration in
Start
secret
ripping shit
from
up out of the
taking
ground.
vast amounts, potentially all of it, under current law. The only question you'd really ask is, can you later go to court and say it was excessive, and would the court side with you? But from a functional standpoint, what they ask for at the FBI, they get. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct, Representative. In fact, I think it's even worse than that, in the sense that it doesn't necessarily need to be evidence of a crime. It could be evidence of some other violation, a non-criminal violation. And also, because the target of a suspicious activity report is prohibited from finding out, it would actually be very hard
Yeah,
for the
Foss,
person
I
to go
might.
to court later and challenge it unless
If
they
I ever
were the subject
disappear,
of
if I
potential
ever, you guys
prosecution,
ever see me
in which
get a
case you're
bulldozer,
already starting behind the apron.
and then I start doing a whole lot of
Okay,
welding
so
videos,
as we stand
you
right
know what's
now,
up.
the Fourth Amendment relative to your banking records, which don't just say what you spent money on, it says where you
We're gonna
were.
test the
Because
cheapest
by
welder on
definition,
eBay.
when you put that credit card into the gas pump, we know exactly where you were. So there's nothing that stops government from finding out
Yeah,
not only what you're
you got to
spending
take
on,
a
but where
blood
you
pressure
are and what
pill,
you're
though.
doing. Is that correct?
Sir, that's absolutely correct. And the reason for
I'm gonna
that
start
is,
becoming a
from
huge
the court's
advocate for
perspective,
weed.
those records aren't yours. They belong to the bank, and therefore you have no protectable privacy right in them. But the court recently has been starting to change their thinking on that type of thing.
Well, and we're hoping to spur the court to think more through legislation. Uh, Summarizing, though, we're talking
They are,
mostly
you know,
about
I
bank
think about
records
that
because those are the
sometimes called
ones
a
that we have
convention
a
of
current
states.
example. But isn't it true that the FBI and other agencies
But man, I just
want the
really don't
same
trust it
access
sometimes
to
when
all of your
when
phone
we watch
records, which would include
these
where
folks.
you are moment by
I got a
moment
hard time
and who
trusting
you
it.
talk to? Is that correct?
Well, yes, that was an issue in the Carpenter case, where law enforcement tried to pull location data from cell phone towers, and the court found that customers have a protectable Fourth Amendment right, even though those records
Hey,
belong
Chris,
to
I'm
the
just
phone
sharing the
company,
pain with you
not
guys,
to the
man.
customer.
So, in
I
closing,
do
for
myself.
everyone
Now
here,
I have a whole therapy.
if I want to get those kinds of records, I'm the FBI. In the case of your phone records, for all practical
Yeah, but
purposes, with
dude,
there
Mark
are
still
exigent
thinks we're
circumstance
restrained,
exceptions, but for
or
all
the
practical
government is
purposes, you need to
somehow
get a warrant.
restrained by the Constitution.
You don't need it for bank
And they ain't giving a
records, but
shit
isn't
about
it
our
true that
Constitution
those records
forever.
very often provide the same information and thus are equally invasive into not just your First Amendment, but
If
your
we
Fourth
actually had,
Amendment
if the
reasonable
Constitution actually
expectation
had
for
teeth
privacy
and
and
people were
the
forced
keeping
to
of
live within
your
those
files
those
and personal
guardrails, we
effects?
would be
I would
fine.
argue they're potentially more sensitive and can provide more accurate information than cell phone towers.
Well, I, for one, would close by saying that I don't see a problem getting warrants. I don't see a problem
Dude,
getting judges.
I used
And
to
this
follow
committee
Martin
has a
Levin a
significant
lot,
role
man.
with FISA and other cases like that. The question is, will we
But
amend
Mark's still kind of
law
living in a
so that
dream
no
world. I
matter
think,
where
where
the
he
data is
thinks
being grabbed by the government, it's being
somehow the
grabbed
Constitution still has
pursuant
authority
to a
over
reasonable
government, and it doesn't.
expectation
Our
that
courts
you
are
have a
so
reason to get it
screwed.
and a judge who agrees. Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this
So
hearing. and I yield
even
back.
when you take
Someone
something to
yields back.
court
Chair recognizes
and
the
it's
gentleman from Massachusetts.
unconstitutional, the courts will uphold the government's case damn near every single time. They do it with firearms all the time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses for their willingness to testify before the committee. As evidenced by today's hearing, the singular mission of this so-called subcommittee on weaponization and the House Republican leadership appears to be the proliferation, or ironically, the weaponization of false narratives for political purposes. Combined with the rudderless efforts to develop evidence for the impeachment of President Biden, these proceedings have become increasingly bizarre at every turn. You know, once upon a time, we were told that the key to all of this was the Hunter Biden laptop. That was the smoking gun that would solve all of this. Until then, it wasn't. Then it was getting Hunter Biden to testify. That was going to be the conclusive evidence. Until at one point he had the courage to walk into a hearing, sit in the front row, and then all of a sudden Republicans rejected his offer to testify
These
publicly.
people lie to
instead
your
voted to hold him in
face so
contempt.
easy. and so
Then it was going
fluid.
to be the testimony of the Republicans' top legal expert witnesses who were going to appear before Congress and offer evidence against President Biden and lay out the legal theory to justify articles of impeachment. But they showed up, all of them with great resumes, but with no evidence. And they testified under oath, that they could not find any evidence that would support or suggest such charges. And finally, last month,
Dude,
the Trump-appointed
these are
special
the
counsel,
guys who
David Weiss,
wanted where they did
announced that he
impeach
had
Trump
indicted
twice over a
Chairman
phone
Jim
call.
Jordan's star witness, former FBI informant Alexander Smirnov, for making false statements
And these are
fabricating
the guys who
evidence
actually
to federal investigators about
spread the
President Biden and his
BS with that
family, including the
phony-ass
shameless
Russian
lies that
dossier
President
about Trump.
Biden sought
And they want
millions
to
in
talk about
bribes from
truth
Ukrainian energy
now.
company Burisma when he served as vice president.
These are the guys
Now,
all running around
Smirnov,
saying that
some of
Hunter
you may
Biden's
not
laptop,
remember,
that
but
wasn't Hunter Biden's
Smirnov is the
laptop. All
guy
that
that
stuff's fake.
Chairman Jordan described, and I'll give you a quote, the chairman's quote, as providing, quote, the most corroborating evidence the Republicans have, close quote, in support of impeachment. So given that Smirnov
Yeah, he
is
did,
being
500.
charged by the Republican Trump-appointed special counsel
I've used that
for
line God knows
lying
how many times.
and fabricating evidence, and the pathetic show that the Republicans have put on so far, that assessment is probably correct. He's probably the best they've got. Now the chairman of this subcommittee is determined to obscure the facts surrounding January 6th. Today's hearing appears to be based on the false narrative
It's one of those
that
things. Reagan
conservative
was good on
Americans and
something.
even Bible
Reagan was absolutely
purchasers
horrible
are the
on a
targets
lot
of
of it.
pervasive and baseless financial surveillance by the federal government. It also follows statements made by several House members downplaying the attacks that Officer Fanon has described at the U.S. Capitol complex as, quote, acts of vandalism, close quote, and a normal tourist visit. That could not be further from the truth. As reported by the Bipartisan Select Committee on January 6th in its final report,
That
our
entire
nation endured
bipartisan
an
committee was
insurrection that
absolute
specifically
horseshit.
sought to violently block congressional
Liz Cheney
certification
and
of the
Adam
2020
Kinzinger.
presidential election. The sheer scale of the mob violence that you saw on the video earlier and the lawlessness that was exhibited that day tested the very fabric of our democracy, with
We're
rioters
not a democracy,
savagely
you
beating
douchebag.
law enforcement
See, this is
officers
where I
like
start
Officer
getting wound up.
Fanon, amid repeated crowd chants such as hang Mike Pence, shoot him with his own gun. The Republican vice president, hang Mike Pence. That's what makes you an extremist. That's what makes you a terrorist. Not just your desire to purchase under the Second Amendment a weapon that you're legally entitled to have. It also warranted additional
But you don't think we should be legally entitled to have any guns?
Authorities
I've watched
to
you plenty of
prevent
times in
more
hearings,
violence
asshole.
leading up to the 2021 presidential inauguration. Officer Fanon, as a former Metropolitan Police officer, could you please tell us how the promulgation of false narratives, like this was just a tourist visit or simple vandalism, how that distorted description affects your ability to do
Dude, I
your
wish
job?
a lot of states, Alabama, Texas, basically any state who wanted to live free would go
Thank
ahead
you
and
for the
secede.
question. Well, essentially, the distortions, mischaracterizations, and
Draw
lies about
treaties for trade and
January
all kinds of
6th,
stuff like that.
resulted in,
It could
or
be
at
done,
least
and it could be done
partially played a
peacefully.
role in me leaving my
And
job as a
We're going to
Metropolitan
live
Police
under our
officer.
constitutions. Our constitutions are going to govern
they
everything
have
we do as a state, which is the way
Inspire
it's supposed to be in the
fellow
first place.
Americans to
And we no longer
threaten
respect
me,
federal authority.
threaten members of my family simply because of the statements that I've made about my experience.
Oh yeah, man.
Both on
AR, he
January
supports
6th,
any kind of gun ban.
2021, and in the aftermath.
Well, thank you very much. My time has expired.
Mr. Chairman.
These guys talk about interrupting official
Thank you for your
proceedings,
service.
but when the abortion
Unanimous
crowd
consent request, Mr. Chairman.
took over the House
Mr.
floor
Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a January 7th,
and
2021
interrupted an
email from
official
the FBI
proceeding,
financial institutions requesting
nobody
information
was
about Edward
arrested.
Larrea,
Nobody
as he,
was
quote,
sent to jail.
claimed to be armed and intending to travel to D.C. to unleash, quote, some violence. I also ask unanimous consent to enter into the record
A press release from the Eastern District of New York announcing Edward Floridia's sentencing for making threats to kill elected officials, like Senator Raphael Warnock, entitled, quote, Queens man sentenced to 33 months in prison for posting threats to kill a member of Congress and illegally possessing
Oh, I can't stand Washington
Objection.
Schultz,
Thank
man.
you.
She's
Gentleman
such a
from Florida is
lying
recognized for 5
sack.
minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's just sitting up here listening to y'all's testimony. It's just absolutely insane, the level of the deep state acting.
And you'll see,
to
you'll
go
watch the
after
Democrats in this hearing. They will almost
pro-life groups,
exclusively
pro-gun groups.
question their single witness.
Mr. Tedesco talked, the Arkansas pro-life group that.
And if they do
now
start
they
to
can't
question
even
any of
bank
the
at
other
bank that
witnesses
they were
out there, they
banking
will try to
out
cut them off,
because
try to
of their
grandstand,
political
try to
beliefs.
gaslight the shit out of them.
The information that the chairman put up about people purchasing religious texts and firearms, all without a warrant. I mean, you know, you go to law school and they teach you constitutional law and the Fourth Amendment and all these things that have to happen in order for the government to get information about you or to search your information. And all of this is happening without even the person knowing that it's going on, without a warrant, without an ability to even to defend themselves. In the aftermath of the 2020 presidential election, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, at the U.S. Department of Treasury told major banks to be on the lookout for customers using credit and debit cards for the purchase of legal firearms. As a gun owner and a strong proponent of our Second Amendment
I think I've
rights,
seen
it's
that
appalling
before, Warsaw.
that a federal agency would ask private companies to spy on their customers conducting perfectly legal business transactions. It's not like there's a suspicion of criminality going on. These are just typical purchases of firearms. FinCEN also passed along a report to several large banks titled Bankrolling Bigotry,
if I don't
an
do it today,
overview
we'll hit
of
it
the
another
online
day.
funding strategies of American hate groups. Included among those supposed hate groups is the Alliance Defending Freedom, which is represented
boss,
before
you're
us
right.
today
These
by Mr.
states, man,
Tedesco. I found this
get so
characterization
much
curious because the
money
ADF that
from
I
the
know
Fed
is anything but a hate
that
group.
it would be extremely
ADF defends
hard
Americans' God-given right to religious
shut
liberty
the
in
tap
courts around
off
this country.
and
But it seems the Biden
them step
administration
away.
views advocacy for religious liberty as hate these days. That says far more about the administration than it does about ADF. President Obama once infamously remarked that many conservative Americans cling to guns
Dude, I
or
seriously
religion.
think that
And given FinCEN's actions,
we
it
probably
seems that
won't have
President
another
Biden's
Republican in
administration
office.
shares the same hostility for millions of
We're
Americans
we're
like me
off
who
the cliff,
proudly
man. We
cling
just
to our
ain't hit the
First and
ground
Second
yet.
Amendment rights. Mr. Tedesco, what's your reaction
But
to
think
your
about it. You know,
organization
even when we
being
do get a
identified
Republican
as
in
a hate
office,
group
most of the
in a
time,
report
they're no
shared by
better
a
than the
government
Democrats
agency?
we get in office.
It's unbelievable that that is being used by the federal government to advise banks on domestic terrorist threats. But
Sam, this is
I
a
think the
federal
bigger point
Congress.
here is that
So
the
this is in
concept
the
of
federal
hate
house.
is a tool of suppression. And on top of that, that kind of language, hate speech, and similar kinds of vague concepts are permeated throughout the financial industry and are used to shut down events and to debank people. JP Morgan Chase has used it several times. Arkansas Family Policy, they said was high risk. They shut down an event by Defense of Liberty on behalf of Donald Trump Jr. was speaking at it. They shut down that event on the basis of a hate policy. So we know these policies are being weaponized in the financial industry. And again, because of the Bank Secrecy Act and a lot of the shrouding of the way regulation happens in the banking context, it's really hard to know why are these things happening. We just know it's on the rise, and it's a real concern.
Well, and one of my
Who
colleagues
they are,
was just
I
saying
think I'm
that this is just a
becoming
narrative
more
that we're
of an
creating,
isolationist.
a political narrative. But you've gone through
Mainly
specifics.
because you can't trust our
if
government.
you want to highlight
You know, they
specifically some
lied
of
to
these
get us
instances that you're
into
referring
Vietnam.
to of
There were lies
facts
that got us into World
where
War II. There were
pro-life
lies that
groups
got us
or
into
organizations
Iraq.
that are
There
conservative
were lies that
have
got us
been
into
debanked by these
Afghanistan
private entities.
and Iraq
So
again.
the highest profile one is a former member of
There are lies that have gotten
the
us
Senate,
into
Samuel Brownback's
a
organization,
lot
National
of
Committee
shit
for
over
Religious
in
Freedom.
other countries in
JP
Africa.
Morgan Chase canceled that account in 2022.
If they were honest about
escalating
things,
in very
that
different
would be different.
reasons that were contradictory over the next year as
Afghanistan,
scrutiny mounted. None of the reasons ever
our
held any
special
weight.
forces guys had
Interestingly
basically
enough,
taken
they
care of
referred to
the
anti-money
terrorist threat in
laundering,
Afghanistan
financing
before
of
Big Army even
terrorism,
got there.
concept called
And the only reason the
politically
Big
exposed
Army, the
persons,
rest of
all
the
of
Army
these are
got there
within
is because
the
all
banking
these other generals had a hard on them.
and I
They
think are
wanted to
used
just
as
go
tools
in.
ultimately to
And not only
suppress
in
people because of their
Afghanistan,
views.
they wanted to hit
Again,
Iraq,
the
they wanted to
secrecy
hit
and the
Iran.
shrouding of the reasons for the decisions is a huge part of the problem. And I think that's something Congress needs to
If we,
address.
if we had an
And is
honest
there
government run by
circumstances
honest
in
people,
which the consumers
would
may
be
never
less of an
know that their
isolationist.
information was privately disclosed from the bank to the FBI or a government
yeah,
agency?
9/11
Yeah, I mean,
was.
this is a huge part of the problem is our clients,
I
to
didn't
a-
believe that for
to
a
a
long
person,
time.
anytime they go to the bank,
It
once they
took
get
a
debanked,
long
it's
time for
always
that
under
to-
some
to
vague
sink in.
policy. The only thing the bank will say is high risk or business type or risk tolerance. Every time they
So
go
it
back
took a
and
long
ask for an
time, a
e-
lot
an
of
answer, a specific reason, the bank just
research,
stonewalls them.
And
So
a
they
lot
can't
of
get access
watching
to the information.
hearings
I
and
only have
all
a couple
kinds of
seconds
stuff
left.
before you can
So
tell you.
what
can't
is
have
your
some
recourse if you
bullshit.
do find out? So let's say, because I basically ticked a lot of those boxes that were referenced, firearms, Bibles, religious texts. So if you do find out
Yeah,
that your
Korea was
information
no.
was divulged from the bank that you banked to a government agency, do you have any recourse whatsoever to go after?
I think he
the
would have
government or the
AR. I
bank?
really do.
It's difficult for consumers who are in that position because they
You
usually
know,
don't
when
know
we
what
went
happens. If
into
it happens,
Afghanistan,
there
like I
are
said, our
consumer
special
complaints you
forces
can file with
guys,
state attorneys general.
and I've seen
There's
interviews
probably
with
other
them,
avenues that people could pursue,
where
but I
they
think
talk
that's
about
part of the
when
reason why Congress should
in
act.
their initial boots on the
uh,
ground in
Cordon off
Afghanistan,
some of the
wherever they went
the
out into the
secrecy
towns
and
and stuff like
confidentiality
that,
that's
a lot of them
happening in
didn't
the
even
banking
carry their
industry, and
damn
also
guns.
affirmatively
Remember, all the
require banks
fighting
to
was up
stop
in the
using
hills.
reputational risk and some of these other vague categories.
But when
to
they went
determine
into a
whether they're
town, they
bank with
towns that were
Thank you all for
complete
being here
war
today.
zones when Big
Mr.
Army
Chairman,
got
I have a
there or
unanimous
got
consent
done with
request.
it. They were out in those
I thank
towns
the
in the
chair.
markets.
I ask
Weren't
unanimous
even
consent to
carrying their
enter into
guns.
the record
Dealing
the
with
FBI's
locals. Locals
situation
knew they were
report
special
sent
forces. They
to
knew they were
financial
American
institutions
troops
with respect
and
to an
loved them
explicit
because they
and
were
clear
getting ready to
threat
trial them.
on January 16th, 2021,
Without objection.
with respect to the inauguration. I thank the chair.
Young lady from California is recognized.
Thank you. I thank our witnesses for being here, and I want to examine some of the actual requests that the FBI sent to financial institutions in the wake of the violence that occurred on January 6, 2021. Not the overly broad groups that my Republican colleagues are purposely trying to scare Americans into believing that are being surveilled every single day without any crime prevention or crime solving purpose in mind. On January 14,
It doesn't matter whether you
2021,
have
the
a
FBI asked
crime-solving purpose
financial
in mind,
institutions
lady.
for
Someone
information
have
about
to, at
Robert
the
Corey
very
Lemke,
least,
who made,
be
quote,
charged with a
interstate
crime,
threats
finish
of
that, get
violence
warrants
targeting the family of a
to look
U.S.
through their
congressman,
accounts and
as
invade
well
their
as other
privacy like that.
in furtherance of
In
anti-government,
purple-haired land whale.
anti-authority extremism. And I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the email dated January 14, 2021 from FBI employee to financial institutions into the record. Lemke ultimately pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 3 years in prison for making threatening interstate communications against members of Congress and journalists in connection with the 2020 election. He sent threatening electronic and audio messages to approximately 50 victims he targeted because of their statements about Donald Trump losing the 2020 presidential election. He sent messages to a New York City congressman's brother threatening him and the brother's children. He sent messages to the family of a journalist, and I would ask unanimous consent to insert into the record the press release entitled "California Man Sentenced to 3 Years in Prison for Making Threats Against Political Officials and Journalists Relating to the Outcome of the 2020 Presidential Election."
Without objection.
Officer Fanone, in your experience, is it appropriate for law enforcement to use all lawfully available tools in the investigation of somebody who's threatening the family of members of public officials or journalists?
Yes, ma'am. It's not only appropriate, it's law enforcement's responsibility to do so.
Would it be a dereliction of duty if you didn't use every lawfully available tool to you to try to prevent a crime
So
from
let me
happening?
get this straight,
Or
lady.
to
You're
solve a
bringing
crime
up
that has already
one
happened?
guy
Yes, ma'am, I believe so.
Thank you. The day
as a
before the
reason for
inauguration, the
surveillance
FBI
on
requested information
a
about Samuel
large
Fisher,
portion of the
who was
American
photographed on the steps of the U.S. Capitol and is suspected of unlawfully entering federal property on January 6, 2021. The FBI noted that Fisher may also have been, quote, manufacturing, trafficking guns in preparation for civil war. Additionally, Fisher espouses racially motivated and anti-government extremist ideology, end quote. The FBI noted that it was, quote, currently preparing enforcement action and is interested in financial information that corroborates Fisher's involvement in firearms tracking. And I would ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the email from FBI employee to financial
nothing like what the government said it
about
was.
this matter into the record.
Without objection.
Officer Fanone, why might law enforcement agencies seek financial information in cases of arms trafficking?
Well, I mean, outside of the obvious that potential receipts or purchases made would
Her version of
provide
arms
evidence
trafficking
that,
is
in fact, the weapons were purchased by
polymer
a
80,
specific individual.
80% arms.
My understanding is,
You were
within
buying gun parts.
these particular requests, it was the FBI seeking voluntary compliance from a number of banking institutions in which their ask was very specific in that they were looking for individuals who were present on January 6th, which I think we can all agree was an incredibly violent
it was
assault
anybody that was
against
in
law
the
enforcement
DC
officers.
metro area.
Those individuals that also had purchased firearms within the past 6 months and were at least there
And I
was
don't think
evidence
they
to
fenced
support
that
they were
off to
planning
6
on
months.
returning to the
But
nation's
here's the thing.
capital
If
on
the
January
banks
20th.
didn't have a
So
code
they
for a
weren't just
firearms
looking for people
purchase
based on their beliefs. There
already,
were 3 different
how
criteria
did
that
they
they were
get
using
that
that
information?
all had to be present in order to do this search. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
Great. Samuel Fisher, by the way, was arrested the very next day. And when he was arrested,
Yeah,
FBI
well,
agents found over
and why
1,000
wasn't
rounds of
Gettelbach
ammunition
asked about
and
that on
several
that
weapons,
Face the
including an
Nation interview?
illegally modified AR-15 rifle and machetes in his Upper East Side apartment and his car. Fisher, by the way, wrote after the Capitol riot, quote, "Seeing cops literally run was the coolest thing I've ever seen in my life," end quote. And I would ask unanimous consent to insert into the record that New York Times article entitled "Dating Coach Charged in Capitol Riot Gets Prison Term for Gun Crime" into the record. This is a clear example of people committing criminal acts that my colleagues across the aisle are claiming are the victims, the innocent victims of surveillance. But in reality, the FBI was doing their job. They were working to prevent threats to the inauguration and to hold January 6th rioters responsible for their criminal actions. Officer Fanone, I want to thank you for being here today, and I appreciate your willingness to bear witness to what really happened on January 6, 2021, and just to dispel these overly broad, fear-mongering tactics that innocent Americans are being surveilled simply because of their beliefs or their religion. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentleman
No.
from Florida for 5
Well,
minutes.
you're probably
Thank you,
missing
Mr.
the part where Saul
I
just
think
can't
jump for you.
think
Mr.
off
Knight,
the
do you
top of
need
their
a gun registration list if government can just go ask the banks every time some customer purchases a gun?
Well, the banks won't know if you purchased a gun per se, but your bank records can be a pretty good, though not perfect, registration for almost anything.
But my point is, it's almost like a backdoor registration, right?
Yes, one of the challenges is that highly sensitive information can be accessed through financial records that otherwise is constitutionally protected.
Yeah. Dr. Peterson, do you think they're just going to stop with conservatives? I mean, my history tells us that the cancel culture mob, the surveillance state, whatever you want to call it, it doesn't just, they never are satisfied with just certain, it always expands. And I'll give you an example.
The vast
A few
majority
years
of
ago,
Americans are like me, you,
Senator
pretty
Feinstein,
much anybody in this
iconic
chat.
Democrat senator
We
from the
just
great
want to
state of
live our lives, we
California,
want to live our lives in
the
peace.
folks in San Francisco
We want to be able to
renamed
go
the
to work.
Dianne
We want to be able to
Feinstein
come home,
Elementary School. They took her name off the school because
take
they
care of
found
our
that she said
families,
something like 40 years
and have a
ago
life
that the
without
cancel
the
culture
government
mob
in our
didn't like. So
pocket
even a
every
liberal
single
Democrat
second
senator
of the day.
wasn't good enough for the mob. They came after her too. And this is the thing that scares me. We've invited probably more Democrat witnesses in front of this committee than any other committee, because we invite Democrats to come in and say, we respect the First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, respect the Constitution. My concern is it never just stops with certain people. It always goes further. Do you agree with that?
Well, the reason I prefaced my remarks with an insistence on nonpartisanship is because the danger posed by this increasing ability of governments and large corporations to collude threatens everyone's freedom equally. And it could well be that at the moment, and this is, I think, the case the Republicans here are trying to make, is that the people who are in the sights of that collusion tend to have more conservative leanings, but that will shift in a moment whenever the political tides shift. And we're concentrating in this hearing a fair bit on the specific events of January 6th, a very partisan issue that produces a very intense partisan divide. We're not addressing the We're not addressing the fundamental issue here directly, which is that our new technology enables a mode of surveillance that's so intense and all-pervading that no one will escape its purview regardless of their political views.
No, I think that's exactly right. And there also seems to me, and I'll go to Mr. Tedesco, there seems to be a pattern emerging. I'm going to take you back to when we first kind of started getting into this issue with the somewhat famous now school board's memorandum from the Department of Justice. And I know you probably remember what I'm talking about here, Mr. Tedesco. But the opening sentence of the Attorney General's document, this memorandum, says in recent months, there's been a disturbing spike in harassment, intimidation, threats of violence against school administrators, board members, teachers, staff who participate in the vital work of running our nation's public schools. At the hearing where we had the Attorney General,
wakes them up a bit.
I asked him a simple question. I said,
Maybe
you
we
make
can
that
get the
opening
ball
statement
rolling.
as the basis for why you need this memorandum to go after moms and dads showing up at school board meetings. What was that first sentence based on? And he told us it was based on the National School Boards Association, the memorandum they put out. And the same thing happened to you guys, because we had some entity here called the Global Disinformation Index puts out this information, and then the government uses that information as the basis to say you're some terrorist group. That is frightening. That our government, because FinCEN, the Treasury Department, used what some agency put out, or not agency, some entity put out as a basis to say you guys are some hate group or some terrorist group. I find that alarming, and particularly the pattern that it, I guess Q doesn't make a pattern, but it sure makes you start to wonder. Your thoughts, Mr. Tedesco?
Sure, the FBI used the SPLC's report on radical traditional Catholics to target them as well in the interim between the Moms for Liberty and parental rights groups and what's going on today. I think it's very alarming that the government uses these obviously partisan and discredited third-party, arbiters of truth who really are just promoting their own political agenda and trying to do damage to their perceived political enemies. To make decisions about anything, let alone sending them to financial institutions as part of some kind of financial surveillance scheme.
Yeah. Some left-wing group says you're bad. Oh, then the government's going to use that information to send out to banks and say, you might want to be concerned about this. You maybe want to debank these. That is a frightening world. And the point is, I don't think it's going to be just limited to conservative people in the future, because we've already seen examples. There were people in Black Lives Matter who got targeted during the summer of 2020 when all the protests were happening around the country. And I disagree with some of the things, a lot of the things that happened that summer, but I also don't like the fact that they're going after liberals either. That's a scary thing. And then there used to be an agreement in both parties that First Amendment activity should be protected. Second Amendment activities, your right to privacy should be protected. But unfortunately now it's gotten.
I'll be back. I gotta grab something to drink.
With that, we will go to the other side. The gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For nearly 20 years in this chamber, I know I've heard time and again Republicans claim that they back the blue. Just recently, Chairman Jordan put out a press release around the Law Enforcement Appreciation Day resolution, which said, when it comes to supporting the police, quote, Republicans put words into action, unquote. Yet when it comes to walking that walk, Republicans too often take a seat. Just yesterday, we took a vote on a bipartisan spending bill that includes funding for our criminal justice programs. Of the Republicans that make up this committee, a handful of you voted against it. That, of course, would mean less funding for state and local law enforcement agencies and more criminals on our streets and in our neighborhoods. That no vote means no funding for the Internet Crimes Against Children program, a key law enforcement tool that keeps online predators away from our children. Those actions sure don't back the blue. And now today, Republicans want to target law enforcement yet again. This time, they purposefully downplay the heinous violence that injured and traumatized hundreds of Capitol Police officers in the January 6th insurrection, perhaps the most infamous assault on law enforcement in recent American history. Specifically, our Republican colleagues are taking aim at the ability to use financial records as a tool to prosecute the coup plotters, the criminals who attempted to stop the legitimate constitutional transfer of power in Congress. These are the very financial tools that help hold to account the people who tried to overthrow a presidential election. Officer Fanon, thank you so much for repeatedly testifying about your experiences. I'm sure it isn't easy, as you mentioned, to relive these traumatic moments. Could you describe some of the violence briefly that Capitol Police officers were subjected to on January 6th?
Certainly. So I, like many other officers from the Metropolitan Police Department, self-deployed that day in that I heard distress calls coming out from officers who were already deployed at the Capitol complex and took it upon myself to respond to those calls for assistance. When I arrived at the Capitol, I made my way to what's referred to as the Lower West Terrace Tunnel in response to a specific distress call coming from officers that were defending that tunnel against a large group of violent rioters that were trying to gain access.
Thank you.
When I entered the tunnel, I observed about 40 or 50 DC police officers and a few U.S. Capitol police officers attempting to hold back the violent mob. The officers were being assaulted with a variety of different weapons, everything from metal poles, 2x4s, aluminum baseball bats, batons, and other police equipment that had been stripped from police officers themselves were then used against officers.
Thank you, Officer Fanone. Thank you. I'm sorry. I want to just make sure I can get some other items in. The video that we saw earlier was disturbing. In a video that I don't have time to show, you can hear words like traitor being yelled at police officers and shouts like F the blue. 5 police officers who served at the Capitol died in the aftermath of the insurrection. Officer Fanone, what's your response to those who say that no police officers were killed by the events on January 6, 2021?
Well, my thoughts on Officer Brian Sicknick. Obviously, Brian Sicknick's cause of death was ruled unrelated to the Capitol riot. That being said, I think that good, decent people would understand that if it were not for his participation in the defense of this Capitol on January 6th against a violent mob, Brian Sicknick would be here with us today. I understand, I think better than most, the post-traumatic stress that accompanied my participation in defending the Capitol on January 6th, and then enduring the mischaracterization or lies about what I experienced that day from people in positions of power, many of whom were here at the Capitol themselves. I understand what brought many officers to taking their own lives, and I certainly attribute their actions to their participation in defense of the U.S. Capitol on January 6th.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman and my Republican colleagues.
I'm surprised they haven't
Once
talked.
again,
There were officers
I ask
killed
that
on
you
January
stop
6th.
trivializing the violent assault the entire world saw that day, both to our democracy and to our law enforcement. And please do not cavalierly discard financial
Oh yeah, they
implications
are
of law
100%
enforcement tools to
Obama's
prevent the next
advising
January
Biden.
6th. The necessity of
What's
making
up,
this
Brother
tool for
Chamber?
law
What's happening,
enforcement
man?
is even more imperative considering the presidential candidate you support all but promises yet another assault, violent or otherwise, on our sacred democracy. And I yield back.
Gentlelady
Mr. Chairman,
back.
before you go to the next member, if I can ask again for unanimous consent request.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record the FBI's situation report sent to financial institutions on January 13th, 2021, which explains in the middle of page 2 the exact kind of threats that the FBI was trying to prevent leading up to the inauguration that day. These were threats to murder members of Congress and start a shooting at the inauguration, the exact type of threats the FBI is responsible for investigating. And I quote, on 8 January, information was received regarding a video posted on an identified website encouraging people to kill senators and Congress members. The poster of the video was identified via social media exploitation. The video was threatening violence in Washington, D.C. on Inauguration Day and advised people to bring guns.
Without objection. We want the FBI to do their job. We just want them to do it in a way consistent with the Constitution. With that, I recognize the gentlelady from New York.
Yeah, you know, the
Thank you, Mr.
FBI
Chairman. Mr. Knight, thank you for your testimony today.
has a job to
In
do.
2022,
They could
gun
do it
ban activists,
constitutionally.
amalgamated bank, and far-left politicians pushed for the creation of an unconstitutional merchant category code to be assigned to firearms retailers to identify, quote, suspect purchases and
Look, that
report
code is
purchasing patterns to law
already
enforcement,
there.
a clear unconstitutional infringement on Second Amendment rights, and a clear backdoor to a gun registry. In fact, failed New York Attorney General Tish James specifically mentioned the importance of labeling gun and ammunition sales as a way to indicate an imminent crime. Since then, some states have banned the code, while states like California have mandated it to surveil Americans' purchases. This is why I introduced the Protecting Privacy in Purchases Act with Congressman Barr and Hudson to put a stop to this code and protect law-abiding Americans from this infringing unconstitutional overreach. Can you explain how does this code threaten Americans' privacy and constitutional rights?
Thank you very much. This code, and if we were to do similar codes for other sensitive issues, risks creating a raft
Okay,
of false
if that code's not
positives from
already there,
individuals who
then how did the
are
FBI
potentially
get that
engaging in Second
information
Amendment
from
activity?
the
Because it's important
banks
to know that the
for
FCC doesn't tell you what
January
people
6th?
buy. It just tells you where they buy it, right? Will be reported to the government as potentially suspicious for no real basis, or at least not a basis that is likely to be reasonable. And that's going to create
Well,
a
our government
database
has
that is
done a
available,
perfect job
that could be searched
of
later.
destroying our
dangerous things about
education
this
system
financial,
for the last 70 years.
databases that these financial records is that they're
and
retrospective.
Basically
And
making a bunch of
perhaps,
drones who don't
just as bad is
question
that
anything.
there's precious little reason to believe it would be effective at its stated goal for a host of reasons I can get into if you want.
And yeah, without warrants.
Yes,
They
please
just call them up and
expand.
say, hey, we
Okay,
want this
so
information.
The problem here
Banks
is
went,
that
oh, yeah,
you
here you
won't
go.
know what someone buys. You're expecting banks to correctly identify what is really a hallmark of violence. You're expecting them to report it promptly. You're expecting law enforcement to then act on it promptly and effectively. And so I'd like to point to, I don't know if they'd like me pointing to it, but Guns Down America has a report that advocates the MCC. But if you look at the examples they point to as possible examples where this could have helped, it's hard to believe they would, either because there's such a short time frame, 12 days. There's a reason to believe, I don't see why we believe that 12 days would be enough time for law enforcement to act on it, because we don't know how fast it takes the government to use any SARS. Or it's hard to actually differentiate suspicious activity from legitimate activity. Rather, they look at cases and then work backwards. So we don't know what the denominator is. We don't know how many false positives there will be. Also,
there will be
in
tons
the
of
recent
false
report, when we
positives.
look at the key bank methodology, it's very, very broad. It's very over-inclusive.
There will be tons
And
of
it
people who just
has
decide to go buy a
thresholds
new
are such
shotgun
that
and a
it's
new
far
rifle
more than you need
before
to
hunting
spend to
season.
commit a horrible act of violence, but less than you'd spend to get a good hunting
Buy a
rifle
new
to
AR,
scope.
buy a bunch of
And
practice
so
ammo.
how confident should we be that we're going to actually get more noise than
I mean, New
signal than
York, you're
noise?
limited to what,
I
like
don't believe
200
we
and
should
something
be.
rounds or something
Given how
like
little
that?
we know
That's all
about
the ammo you can buy?
how SARS are treated as is, I think we should be deeply skeptical.
And do you
Or
believe this is a
all the
backdoor
ammo
to a gun
you can
registry?
legally
I
have?
believe I believe
That's not even a
some of
good
its
day at the
supporters
range.
view it as a backdoor to discourage firearms purchases.
Well, in my district in upstate New York, and Americans across this country are proud to stand up for our
Yeah,
constitutional
look at
rights and
Chris and
understand
other
this is an
shooters that we know
infringement
that are
on our
out there
constitutional
competing and
rights.
stuff.
Why is my bill so
Hundreds of
important?
rounds do they fire,
Well, ma'am,
in an
I think that
average
efforts
week
to
at the range?
efforts to restrict the collection of data at the bank level are the best option we have currently, because under current law, unless we can reform the BSA, once the bank has that data, government has that data. So preventing the collection at the bank level is your first best option.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to yield my time to the ranking member, but I just wanted to say to Officer Fanone, I was on the House floor on January 6th. We haven't had a chance to talk, but
And
I know
none
you
of
have
you
kids.
ballless, spineless
My wife is at home with our son Jordan. who was 22.
representatives
She was 7 months pregnant.
could have walked out there and talked to that crowd.
You know, thanks to your bravery, the bravery of your colleagues, and of true patriots who defended this Capitol, I believe I got to meet my son Cameron. I want to thank you for your service. Thank you for your bravery. I'm sorry that you had to endure so much of this personal attacks to try and undermine what you actually did that day. But I want you to know that people all
Look, I
across this
support
country
cops when they're doing
know what
things
you did,
within the Constitution.
respect you, and appreciate
I
your service.
will not support cops
Thank
when they're
you.
doing
I'll
things
yield to the ranking
far
member.
exceeding their constitutional
Thank you very much,
authorities,
Mr. Allred.
or when they enforce
I believe we
unconstitutional
all
gun
share those
laws.
sentiments. I want to say that this is not a partisan issue. I heard it said that January 6th is a partisan issue. I just want to read something. A mob was assaulting the Capitol in his name. These criminals were carrying his banners, hanging his flags, and screaming their loyalty to him. It was obvious that only President Trump could end this. Former aides publicly begged him to do so. Loyal allies frantically called the administration. But the president did not act swiftly. He did not do his job. He didn't take steps so federal law could be faithfully executed and order restored. Instead, according to public reports, he watched television happily as the chaos unfolded. He kept pressing his scheme to overturn the election. Even after it was clear to any
What's up, Brother
reasonable observer
Agarizer?
that Vice President Pence was in danger, even as the mob carrying Trump banners were beating cops and breaching perimeters, the president sent a further tweet attacking his vice president. Predictably and foreseeably under the circumstances, members of the
Never
mob
mind the fact
seems
that
to
Trump
interpret
told
this
people to
as a
protest
further
peacefully,
inspiration to
told people to be
lawlessness
peacefully many
and
times.
violence. That was the Senate Republican leader, Mitch McConnell. This is not partisan.
Like, I
And
give
the
a
reason we
rat's
kept
ass
saying
about
this
that
is about
swamp rat
January
Mitch
6th
McConnell.
is because it is about January 6th. They're trying to expand the scope of what the FBI was trying to do. It was not to invade all Americans' bank records. It was not about
Then why are they still
violation
searching
of the
for
Fourth
key words
Amendment
in
against
people's
search and
bank
seizure.
transactions you had?
I've been a practitioner of the law, not just a law professor, not just someone with a graduate
That
degree from law
terrified
school,
me, this
but a
woman.
prosecutor, an investigator, and you use the tools that you have to prevent crimes from happening. Because guess
No.
what? I've shopped in a Bass
You
Pro Shop
prosecute
plenty of times.
crimes
I read the
after
Bible
they
on a
happen.
regular basis.
You don't
I
take
happen to
someone
be
and
in my
put them through
family,
the
happen to
legal
be gun
system before they
owners.
have committed a
But
crime.
I'm not afraid that the FBI is going to be searching my account because
See,
I
this
was
is that,
also
oh,
not
if you ain't
a
got nothing to
rioter
hide, don't
on
worry about it.
January 6th. And I did not purchase a gun in the last 6 months before the inauguration and make plans to come back to attempt to again stop
Those guns
the
didn't
free
have to be
and fair
purchased in
election
DC.
of our government.
It was a gun purchase anywhere at any
ridiculous.
time.
Officer Fanone.
God, these people are so dishonest.
Officer Fanone, you saw the violence on January 6, 2021, and you saw the individuals. You were up close and way too personal with many of them. You also, unlike many of the people here, attended hearings, trials, and sentencing of many of those individuals.
For
Based
people who
upon the
merely
knowledge that you
paraded.
have, that many of us here on
Fuck,
this
that
dais
is.
do not. Do you know what ideology the January 6 rioters embraced? And how do you, if you do, how do you know that?
It was white supremacy.
I'm sorry, ma'am. I can't speak to every single individual that was there that day at the
Even
Capitol.
though watching
I
those
didn't have an
live streams, there were
opportunity to
people of
interview them. I
every
was too
fucking
busy
color in
fighting
that
for my
crowd.
life. That being said, I was present at a number of the sentencing hearings regarding individuals that were specifically charged with and later pled guilty to violent assaults of myself and other officers. And many of those individuals, in their plead for leniency to the judge at sentencing, cited the fact that they had been inspired by and by rhetoric used by the former president, by misinformation from
Yes,
news media
because the
outlets
state, the
that led them to
government
believe
gave
that the
them a
2020 election had
statement
been
and said, if
stolen,
you sign this,
and that it was their
we'll plea you
patriotic
out and
duty
we
to,
won't
in
put you in
fact,
prison for 40
respond to the
years and
Capitol
ruin your
that
entire
day
life.
and fight to save their country.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentle lady yields back. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized for 5 minutes.
We began this hearing by reciting the
How come
Pledge
none
of
of these
Allegiance. I'd like to
spineless
begin my
Republicans can
questioning
even bring that up?
by
Why not?
reciting the Fourth Amendment, because I think the other side of the aisles kind of forgot some of the terms that are in there. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. This is in our Constitution. Mr. Michel, can you tell us
Oh, the
how
VA
the
is
Bank
absolutely
Secrecy
horrible and
Act
always has been.
and exemptions to the Right to Financial Privacy Act may not be in compliance with the Fourth Amendment, or how the implementation of those acts
Hold on, let me
may
crank this
violate the
down
Fourth
just a
Amendment?
little bit.
Sure. Much like Brian, I alluded to.
I got a
minute
little
ago,
bit more I can
once
watch
a
this before I
bank
got to head to
or
work.
financial institution
Now, you
has
talk
it,
about
the
VA
government
hospitals.
has it.
It was
So,
94
this came up in the early Supreme Court,
maybe.
early court challenges. It came up in the Supreme Court cases that eventually.
Maybe
those cases eventually went to the
93.
Supreme Court.
When
In
my
that you have
when my
you
grandparents
effectively have a
passed away, my
law
uncle or my
that
granddaddy Frank.
is a blank check to the federal government or
Matter of fact,
law
I've told
enforcement
stories.
to
You know, I've still got his old
take
22 that he
all of
gave
your
or that I
information
got after he
simply
passed.
without a warrant. So
But he was basically
cause,
gone in
do
the
not
VA
have to
hospital
get
in
a
New
warrant, do
Orleans.
not have to show
I
probable
mean,
cause to get the warrant.
he was just on life support, so all the
oath or
family could get
affirmation?
there. We had to drive in from Georgia.
No,
To a judge.
no.
But I was talking to a
No.
bunch of vets downstairs. I was standing there
Yeah.
smoking a
So
cigarette
it
with them.
seems to me that
And they said there was a dude that was
these
supposed to have
acts,
surgery the
they're
day
not
before.
just,
In
out
his
of date,
surgical
but they're
gown, had
outside of
lines
the
drawn on them where they
Constitution.
were going to do stuff, and said that dude ran out of that fucking
Mr.
hospital
Knight,
like that bitch was on
you
fire,
began
jumped in
your
a cab
opening
and left.
statement by
And they ain't
characterizing some
see
of
him
the
no more.
things that the government could know
That
or
hospital was
infer
a
about you based on how you spend
nightmare.
your money. Could you elaborate on that or reiterate what
I
are the
won't
things
go
the
into all of
government
it, but it
can
was
know
I was
or infer based on purchase
I like to hit the
habits?
damn roof in
Government
that
can
place.
know almost everything about you with a relatively high degree of confidence.
Talk
Know where
about
you
zero
live,
respect for
figure out where you
people,
work, they can
zero
figure
respect for
out
vets.
potentially things like your
It's
sexual orientation. They can figure out, or at least have a high
and they've
degree
always
of
been that way. I've been through plenty of VA hospitals
guessing
with
what your interests
um,
are.
parents,
Figure
with
out or have a
uncles,
high degree of guessing what your religion is, what
grandparents.
political beliefs you support, and they can potentially figure out, or at least have a better than average chance of knowing whether or not you own a firearm.
I've never been to
They
a
can
single VA
also
hospital, whether it was
potentially know
one
if
in
you
Little
had an
Rock,
abortion. And it's worth noting
New
that after the
Orleans.
Dobbs decision, there was a lot of concern raised about the sensitivity
over
of
here in
medical
Alabama,
information that would be available under
where
the
I
Bank
saw
Secrecy
vets
Act
treated
in
with
a
actual
state that
respect.
prohibits or severely
Not
restricts
one.
abortion. And so I just really want to drive home the point that this is not a left or right thing or an R or D thing. This is a situation where everyone has sensitive information that is potentially accessible with basically no due process.
Dr. Peterson, why are you such a Luddite? Why don't you embrace artificial intelligence and facial recognition and massive computer surveillance and cameras on every street corner so that we could all be safer?
Well, because there's tremendous danger and too much security. If the emerging collusion between government and corporation, gigantic corporation, continues in the manner that it is continuing, there won't be anything that you do that can't be used against you and will be used against you in very short order. And the concerns that are expressed here about the local consequences of that, let's say with regards to January 6th, seem to me to fail to take into account the much broader threat that lurks underneath that everyone should be attending to. We're in danger of eliminating the private sphere entirely. That's already happening in places around the world, particularly in China, which is why I made reference to that. That technology is at hand. And it appears as though both giant governments and giant corporations are utilizing it in every way that they can manage. And it's often motivated by the claim that that's forestalling an immediate proximal threat, right? Well, that's a short-term justification
Yeah,
for
give up
engaging
your
in a
liberty.
tremendous long-term danger. And it should be perceived as dangerous to those on the left who are politically committed, because it will be the politically committed who are first identified by such systems.
Is it true that you have a PhD?
Yes.
Well, then why did Canada decide that you needed more education? Can you tell us about that?
Well, one reason, the entire transcript of an interview that I did with Joe Rogan was submitted as evidence with regards to the unacceptability of my views. What I was doing primarily in that interview that was criticized was questioning the validity of the economic models of economic collapse that were stacked upon the unstable models detailing out climate change 100 years into the future. That was deemed in Canada sufficient to proceed with complaints against me with
Hey,
regards
look,
to my
all I'm
professional
saying is,
competence
Chess, if
to
you hit
serve
that
as
thumbs
a
up, it's going to
licensed
damage your
psychologist.
social
That was
credit
only
score.
one of many anonymous complaints that were fostered directly in relation to my political views.
Y'all
Well, I
social
thank you
credit
for
score would
showing
be
up
just
today. I
as
think
good as
They may
mine.
use your testimony as evidence that your
Hopefully in the
re-education has
toilet.
not been successful. I yield back to the chairman.
Well done. The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Knight, you come from the Mercatus Center, funded generously by the Koch brothers, as was the Cato Institute. And I, of course, represent George Mason University, where you're located. I have a simple question for you. The Republican conference chair, Elise Stefanik, recently said people who are being imprisoned for crimes committed during January 6th are hostages. Do you agree, yes or no, that the people who have been
I agree.
arrested, tried,
Political prisoners.
convicted, sentenced, and are serving those sentences are in fact hostages?
I have not studied that. My initial inclination is no. And if I can elaborate, I have not read all the transcripts of all the convictions, but I will assume the answer.
I thank you. I just find it interesting. You can opine about amendments to the Constitution and infringements and warrants, but you haven't really looked at the issue of whether people who committed crimes in January 6th are hostages.
I've looked at it.
Or not.
Call me to
Thank you
testify.
for that moral equivocation. Officer Fanon, maybe you don't want to equivocate. What do you think? I mean, I'm listening to my colleagues, I'm listening to this testimony, and apparently
The government
you got it
threatens
wrong.
to
On
destroy
January 6th,
your
there were
life,
peaceful citizens
put you in prison for
simply
decades
protesting on
because
behalf of
you
their First,
walked through
Second,
the
and Fourth
Capitol.
Amendment rights, carrying Bibles,
And then they offer you a deal and
who
go,
had
if
just
you sign this
assembled
paper,
peacefully
if you plead
to
to
express
this,
themselves
then you're out
here in
in
the
a
Capitol.
year, maybe
Isn't that what
two,
you
maybe
encountered
6
on January
months.
6th?
And you can get some semblance of
That
your
couldn't be
life back.
further from the truth. I mean, my encounter was brutal. It was violent. It involved a number of individuals restraining me, beating me. At least one individual, while I was being restrained, beaten, subjecting me to electroshock from a taser device on my neck.
But you guys did that to
all the
peaceful
while
people
resulting in
during that event.
injuries I
And that's
sustained
kind of
as
what
a traumatic
pissed
brain
other
injury,
people off.
as well as a heart attack.
So, Mr. Tedesco talked about, among other things, law enforcement running roughshod over.
And let's not
citizens
forget all the
who are
questions about the
simply
election that
expressing
could
their
have
First
been
and Second
addressed and
Amendment rights.
alleviated all this.
I had the impression.
Let's also
that,
not
law
forget that
enforcement,
Trump
they
wanted the
apparently
National
violently
Guard there
seizing Bibles
off
of
the
good
rip.
Christians who were simply
And
trying
then
to
Nancy
exercise
Pelosi shot
their
that
faith
down.
because we were targeting them for their faith.
And how many feds were in that
What
crowd?
happened on January 6th?
Listen, I responded to the Capitol that day for no other purpose than to assist fellow officers who were calling out for help. I didn't care about the location, the Capitol building itself, and quite frankly, I didn't give a shit about the members of Congress. I just came here because cops needed help. That was it.
We'll pretend you didn't say that first part.
Yes.
By the way, just an by the way, because we've heard some interesting testimony again. In your law, how long were you
If they
in law
do the
enforcement?
same thing in 24 that
20
they
years.
did in
those
20, they
years,
might
were
actually
you
see an
ever made aware
insurrection.
of any effort by the FBI or law enforcement in general to surveil the financial information of individuals because of their beliefs or views? Because that's what we're being led to believe has been occurring.
No, and I worked in
I'm sorry,
collaboration.
real loud and clear. 20 years of experience, have you ever experienced what they're describing?
No.
No. Would you find that odd?
That would be a
if
lie.
you did stumble upon it?
Yes.
Why?
Because it violates the very principles of law enforcement, upholding the Constitution and respecting Americans' rights.
So I'm gonna run out
When
of
the
time.
banks, even if
first
you
of all,
believe
I cannot
January
tell you
6th
how
was that
much,
horrible,
even though I am a member of Congress.
when the
I
banks
was on the floor
cooperate with
on
the
January
federal
6th.
government
I heard it.
without warrants
I
and
saw
give
it.
them blanket information on
Cannot
all of their
imagine what you've gone through
customers,
and how you were still living through PTSD. My
that
office
should
was
scare
attacked
any
last
damn
May,
body.
and we're still living through PTSD, and it was violently attacked. And I can only imagine.
Good
And
Lord,
you are a
man.
hero. And
These people are,
no
they
matter
are
what the
such
attempts may be of some
and some of them, it's
to
going to be real
minimize,
fucking funny
diminish,
if
or
they
even
ever,
fabricate
disarm
what
us and
really
put us
happened
on
on
trains
January
when they're
6th.
on the train with us
I
going,
assure you,
but we were the
there are a
good
number of
guys.
us
And
who
you're
will
going to go,
continue to
well,
fight for
I
turf and
know
make
you
sure
were
the American
useful
people know
idiots.
exactly what happened, and that
Welcome
we won't
aboard.
equivocate about whether criminals who are justifiably in jail for their crimes that day are not hostages. They're criminals. They violated the law. And I cannot think of a more significant breach of the Constitution than a violent attempt to prevent the free
You didn't care
exercise of
about
an election
Antifa
being
and Black Lives
counted
Matter
here in
burning down
California.
entire
I
cities.
yield back.
But when a group show up where you work, all of a sudden it's an insurrection and all
Chairman.
these
Thanks,
people are terrorists and got to go to prison.
for the witnesses
Fuck
being
off.
here today. And, we're here to talk about apparently a range of things that don't involve the topic of the hearing. And I think that's disappointing. Freedom surrendered is rarely reclaimed. And we have an opportunity to do that. Few of the rights protected by our Constitution are more infringed than the right to privacy. My colleague, Mr. Massey, read the actual text of the Fourth Amendment. And Mr. Peterson, Dr. Peterson, you referenced kind of what a lot of people might wish it said. It does not say that if you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. It says that you have a reasonable expectation of privacy. It doesn't say you have an expectation of complete secrecy. The reasonable expectation of privacy is guarded by due process, warrants, and subpoenas for U.S. citizens.
Yeah, we haven't had due process for
You might
decades
not know
in this country.
that many of the members of this committee are part of something really rare in Congress, which is a nonpartisan view. We've got divisions that don't break on party lines on privacy. There are Republicans and Democrats who want to roll back the Patriot Act. What a beautiful name, but it's being used to violate American citizens' rights to privacy. We have one of the rarest things possible. You have Mr. Jordan and Mr. Nadler in complete agreement on how to reform the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And frankly, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act part works pretty well. It's the Domestic Surveillance Act. Well, there isn't one because the Fourth Amendment guards it. It says you're supposed to get a warrant. And we're covering a giant hole here, not about January 6th. What about the Bank Secrecy Act and third-party doctrine? Things that are being abused, weaponized against the citizens of this country. Now, they don't have all these same safeguards in Canada. And Dr. Peterson, you've experienced some of the consequences of not having the safeguards that we have in this country. I wonder if you could elaborate on how consequential it is to have the safeguards we do have here on privacy and speech.
Yeah, but those safeguards aren't respected.
Well, I know that my colleagues on the psychological front and on the medical front in Canada are increasingly frightened of making any of their political opinions known in any form whatsoever, because governmental agencies, usually of the mid-level bureaucratic sort, have been empowered as a consequence of our lack of First Amendment rights to intervene as they see fit in relationship to stated opinion, political or otherwise. And it's not good. It's seriously not good. And there's new legislation coming up also reflecting that lack of proper constitutional protection that will make even the suspicion that a crime may be committed punishable. That's Bill C-63, which is pending before the Canadian.
These are dangerous ideas, and I appreciate that you highlighted how China's using it. And frankly, there are people in the United States pushing for a central bank digital currency that at the core is a violation of privacy. It is really the one ring to rule them all. It is a massive amount of coercive power. And at the root of it is
Gee,
the
didn't we talk
surveillance
about that
capability.
earlier?
And a lot of that, Mr. Knight, you've highlighted with the consequences of the Bank Secrecy Act. And I just wonder, you know, a couple of you have highlighted the cost benefit ratio, Mr. Michelle, as well. Maybe you could highlight the consequences of the Bank Secrecy Act and how we might reform it so that we can accomplish the stated goal of safety, but in a more constitutional framework.
Happy to speak to that. I think what we've seen in this hearing is that one of the big consequences is that people blur the distinction between not being able to access information or being able to access information subject to due process. There's no reason to believe that the convictions obtained after January 6th would be impossible without getting a warrant or information subject to one of the exceptions to the warrant provision for exigent circumstances. We also have to worry about the fact that information is being collected and is very collectible. If you are worried about your political opponents having power, why do you want this available to them?
Thank you. You know, Mr. Michelle, you mentioned the third-party doctrine and the hazard of that. I mean, frankly, I'm reminded of a story that's disputed whether it was fully accurate or not, but when Nikita Khrushchev became the leader for the Soviet Union, he was pointing out how brutal the regime had been under Stalin. And someone from a large crowd yelled to him, "Why didn't you do anything?" And here he is, the dictator of the Soviet Union,
Meet the
no
new
one knowing
boss.
the kind of
Same
power
as the
that he
old
could
boss.
wield. And he said, "Who said that? I demand to know who said that." And everyone got quiet. And he let it stay quiet for a very long time. And he said, "That's why. Because you know the coercive power of the state." Now, I would submit that the police state powers that have existed in previous eras of history are minor compared to the capabilities that we have. When you link that to the consequences of the unmitigated third-party doctrine, can you lay out for us what's at stake?
Well, it literally means that anytime you engage in any commercial transaction, you are effectively saying, okay, I don't have due process anymore, which is rather insane. It turns the concept completely on its head that we all have due process.
So I think we have a really incredible burden to produce legislation that does reclaim the freedom that has been surrendered. And I hope we continue to work together in a bipartisan fashion to deliver that reform. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
I have a
Unanimous consent from.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request entitled, this is an FBI liaison information report entitled Domestic Violent Extremists Emboldened in Aftermath of Capitol Breach. It cites online rhetoric regarding the 20 January presidential inauguration, with some calling for unspecified justice for the January 6th shooting by law enforcement of an individual at the Capitol building, and another positing that, quote, many armed individuals would return on 19 January, according to open source reporting.
Objection.
Thank you.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, hey, just hold 1 second, if you could. We'll stop your time. I should have mentioned, if any of you need a break, just let us know. We'll be, if you have to run to the restroom or anything like, just let us know. We've been going at this 2 hours. We probably got a half hour to go. If you can find, but if you need a break, just let us know and we'll go there. I apologize. Gentleman's recognized.
No problem, Mr. Chairman. It's unfortunate that this hearing is tended to focus on January 6th and the inaugural that followed 2 weeks later, because there is a legitimate question about the gathering of information, mostly by private sector, businesses and the like, and then the government accessing that information. It's a worldwide phenomena, and it is something that we should be focusing on. Unfortunately, what's happened here in this hearing is that we've taken the January 6th issue, the insurrection, the violence, the harm that came to Officer Falone and others, and morphed it into a larger question of our civil liberties. That's unfortunate. But here we are, using this hearing to somehow degrade the violence and the insurrection itself and the ultimate effort to destroy our democracy. So I think we have to stay with that a few seconds. Officer Fallon, just a couple of questions I want to get clear. Do you have the number of insurrectionists, rioters that have been charged and found guilty?
Correct.
You know that the number is, I think, over 1,100?
That's my understanding, close to 1,200.
In this process, was any information developed that indicated there might be future violence? For example, at the inaugural?
Yes, that's my understanding from speaking to those involved in the investigation.
Do any of the witnesses disagree with that? And based on this, is it reasonable for the federal government, FBI, and other agencies to investigate certain individuals in an effort to prevent future violence? Is that a reasonable thing for the government to do?
Again, I don't even think it's reasonable. I think that it's a requirement.
Now, do any of you disagree that it would be reasonable for the federal government to investigate those who were involved and the threats that there might be future violence? Is that something that the FBI and others should do?
I would disagree with that to some degree. It depends on how they do it. Because
Thank you. Point well made. Not going to.
okay, yeah.
So the notion of continued investigation based upon information received as a result of the conviction and investigations of those that were involved in the insurrection, the rioting, would be reasonable. So now we get.
Sandy, what's up, brother?
This is where this hearing really got off track.
Yeah, you're going to start to see more cameras and more cameras.
To equate this issue of our
traffic
personal
cameras
liberties and privacy,
pedestrian
with the January
cameras.
6th insurrection. We need to divide these two issues. There's no doubt we had an insurrection. There's no doubt we had a riot. There's no doubt that Officer Fallon, you were injured along with 140 other officers.
There was a riot.
The film that was shown
Okay.
earlier clearly
Insurrection?
demonstrates that.
No.
And your own testimony. We thank you for your
How that riot got
work
kicked
that
off?
day.
There were a
I
couple
agree with Mr. Connolly.
idiots in the
You may not
crowd,
think it important
but
to
there was
protect
also
us.
the
We certainly
police
thought-
escalating
thank you
things,
for
and there
having
were
done
also
so.
feds in the
The
crowd
reality
that were
is
trying to
that,
stir
it
people up.
was extraordinary, serious event in America's history. It was the single largest assault on police ever in the history of this nation. Now, based upon that, where do we go? Put that over here. And then, Mr. Chairman.
And we're gonna see more of that.
Put all of that aside and stop trying to protect Mr. Trump or anybody else that was involved in that riot and that insurrection. And let's get down to the issue of protecting our civil liberties. There are multiple examples that could be used and evidence that could be used to get to that point. Some of it presented by the witnesses today, unfortunately wrapped up in the January 6th and the insurrection and the subsequent question of the inaugural. I do note, as I drove here this morning, that a new fence has been put around the Capitol building.
Huh.
This speaks to all
Say it
of
ain't
our
so.
safety. And why is it that in America today we have need for a new 7-foot-high fence around the Capitol on the day that the president arrives to give his State of the Union?
Oh,
So,
well, let me
I think
see.
I'll just leave it there.
Probably because y'all are a bunch of lying sacks of shit. The American people are getting a little
Mr. Chairman,
pissed.
if you would put aside your desire to go after and protect the president and get down to the issues that are really critically important for all of us, I would appreciate it. And I think this country would also.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady
You
from
know,
Wyoming.
people had
recognized for 5
serious
minutes.
questions about the
Thank you,
election. You
Mr.
could say
Chairman.
they were all
We've
wrong.
been focusing on how
But when they
technological
had serious
platforms and
questions, that
advancement
many
further
people, the
fuels
government could have
weaponization of the federal
done
government
something to
in
investigate and
collaboration with
alleviate
big
that pressure.
corporations against the
Instead,
American
you just
people.
told
At
everybody to
least
get
that was
fucked.
the intent of this hearing, and it is the intent of the folks on this side of the aisle. Today, it is how developments in financial technology have aided the surveillance of the American people And during our last hearing, we focused on how AI is expanding the monitoring and
Shit, I'd make it a
suppression of
30-foot
speech.
fence, throwing
Today,
a
I
moat
want to
with
focus
crocodiles, Manny.
on new reporting which connects the financial surveillance and AI together. Last month, journalist James O'Keefe posted a report alleging that the
Sure, there are
IRS
some
and
starving
DOJ
Nile
were
crocodiles
utilizing
we could
AI
find a home for.
technology to assist with the surveillance of American bank accounts. These allegations are that AI can access bank accounts and look inside those accounts versus just seeing activities in the account. This surveillance by the IRS is being done without a warrant, and it is being done in coordination with the DOJ. Just 2 months before this revelation, FinCEN informed us in staff briefings
Look at all the starving
that banks were
crocodiles in
beginning to
Africa. We
deploy
need to find
AI
them a new
technology
home.
in their business models. Meanwhile, we are watching Google's Gemini's failures from its politically biased model, which Google co-founder Sergey Brin called left-leaning, which I believe is pretty much the understatement of the year. In the report released
Sam,
by
it's
this
all being
subcommittee
done for
last
your
night, we
safety.
document how the FBI and FinCEN reported information to assist financial surveillance, which certain Americans based on strictly conservative ideas. Mr. Knight, you noted that we are limited to speak on what has been reported
Yeah, that
related
would
to
be
the
kind of fucked
financial
up.
surveillance regime because so little is known
Let
by
our
the
crocs
public
die
in
from fentanyl
Congress.
poisoning.
The timeline that I just described provides little detail, but it does show that this
Oh, we
area
definitely do.
is developing very quickly and
Especially
raises further concerns
starting around
about
me,
federal
the
agencies
South.
undertaking dragnet surveillance using financial records.
We got lots of
Based on
dealers.
what we know so far about the coordination between the financial sector and federal government, does the addition of AI into this equation cause even greater concern regarding the scope and scale of financial surveillance that we can expect to occur in the future?
So I believe it does for several reasons. One, to the extent that it makes something less expensive, you'll get more of it. Two, to the extent that AI is not well tuned, either intentionally or unintentionally, you're going to get the risk that you're going to not only have more false positives, but also that it's going to start selecting for information that may not be appropriate. Three, there's concern, and I don't want to overblow the concern, but it does exist, that AI tends to be opaque, and this regime is already opaque enough. So if the great powerful Oz is spitting out records that it considers suspicious and you don't know why, and we can't assess how appropriate it is, that's obviously very problematic. And so I think that we do need to be cautious. And I would say one distinction between this and maybe some other areas is here we're talking about feeding information to the government. So there are constitutional implications here that don't necessarily exist in other areas. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be cautious in other areas, but we should be especially cautious here.
I mean, if the government can't get the information just by asking, they will go to third-party groups and buy your information from them
relation to
without warrants.
this liberty infringing regime that we're dealing with right now, the Biden administration, is the fact that it removes human accountability.
Every bit of electronic communication we do is being collected.
The information we have so far came from a paper trail.
All of our
from a
social media,
government employee.
phones, all
Yet
that.
with AI, that paper trail is going to disappear. Mr. Michel, what could another layer of secrecy achieved by displacing human action with AI do to further erode our liberties and basic guarantees of privacy?
Well, I mean, at first I would just caution that banks and financial institutions have been using technology at an increasing rate for a very long time. And the problem still, the bigger problem is the principle. And if we guarantee due process and we guarantee that law enforcement needs a warrant to get that information, then I think that's a better place. But aside from that, yes, the better and the broader the technology allows people to reach, or the finer detail that it allows people to get, then obviously the more of it you're going to get. But I think Brian is right in that it's going to make it more efficient and less costly, so you'll get more of it.
The fact is, yes,
Again,
there are that many
principle
stupid Americans
of
that
the
vote
Fourth
for
Amendment, the
people
due process,
like
that's
that.
what's key here.
Thank you. I appreciate that. With that, I yield back.
I wouldn't put
Gentlelady
her in the
back to the
category,
gentlelady
but
from California.
definitely the leftists
Or Texas,
and the
excuse me, I'm sorry.
statists definitely put them in that category.
Ladies, there's a huge difference. Thank you.
I definitely put
Thank you, Mr.
this
Chairman,
next
and,
one in that category.
Thank you to all the witnesses who are here this morning. On the morning of January 6th, I joined my colleagues in the House to certify the historic election of President Joe Biden and Vice President Harris. But
It was
that
a
day quickly became a dark day in our nation's history. Within hours, the Capitol was overrun by domestic terrorists sent there by President Trump. I don't mean terrorists in some academic or legal or political science definition. I mean, I was terrified. My staff with me was terrified.
So that
Many of my
70-something-year-old
colleagues
grandma
around
who
me, both
walked through
Democrat
the
and
rotunda,
Republican,
staying
because
within the
this is
ropes,
not
waving
a
her little
partisan
American
issue,
flag, she's a
were also
terrorist according to this
terrified.
hag.
Now, some of my colleagues have already forgotten the violence and terror that we all experienced together. And we've heard some of the comments. They think they should be called hostages. They think they should be treated as patriots. Well, they were terrorists, plain and simple, in my books. I learned for the first time that there are gas masks underneath our seats on the House floor, designed to keep us from chemical or biological attacks when I was told to put one on. Imagine.
Yes,
We were
you guys all
told to
stay in your
put on
cages,
gas
don't question your
masks.
rulers, eat your
My
bugs,
colleagues and
shut
I on the
up.
floor were hiding between seats, barricading doors, and some of us calling their families as the mob grew louder and more terrifying. They were pounding at the door trying to get in. Where's Nancy? Hang Mike Pence. Where's Nancy? Where's Nancy? They set up gallows to prevent them from coming in.
You
The
couldn't have
intentions
hung
of
a
these terrorists were
midget on
clear.
those gallows.
Overturn the election and kill the Democratic elected leaders they believed stood in their way. Anyone
A
who
regular
claims this
person
was not a
standing up on
terrorist
these
attack,
gallows,
a violent
the
insurrection,
top bar for the
is
gallows
simply
was
not facing
probably
reality,
chest
and
level
as
or
our
lower.
witnesses said, they're just plain and simple lying. Even in California, they would call that lying. Despite every truth, here we are today. More myths and more misleading information given to the American people. Well, Officer
And who's giving that
Unknown,
information to them?
thank
Oh,
you
I get
for being
you.
there and also for having the courage to come to testify today and to reminding us all about the truth of that day. Some colleagues wrap themselves in Blue Lives Matter flags for social media and throw it in the trash for the officers who watched
Well, yeah,
over
I
our
mean, you're right, pretty
democracy.
much right about that,
I will
Zany.
never
She's so
forget what I saw
fucking
and felt
inept at her
that day.
job.
And without your sacrifice and some of those
Kind of like her
died
being
that
the
day or
border
were
czar.
injured that day, defending the Constitution and all enemies, foreign and domestic. So, Officer Unknown, while law enforcement kept us safe inside the Capitol, outside the building, you were facing staggering odds. Reports indicate that the west side of the crowd outnumbered officers 58-1. One officer there requested backup at least 17 times in 78 minutes. Did you and your colleagues ever get the sense that you were defending democracy that day?
That's not anything that those thoughts never crossed my mind. Again, like I said, I responded to the Capitol.
She's right. They were defending
Getting
democracy.
distress calls coming from fellow
They weren't
officers.
defending a constitution.
And when I was fighting, I was more concerned with my own survival and that of my colleagues than the totality of what that day would later come to represent.
Right. As you reflect now, do you see the connection? Do you see what really was happening that day? It was not just the violence of the mob, but it was an attack on everything that we stand for as a country.
Yes, ma'am, that's my assessment.
Thank you. Many members have publicly spoken about and recorded memories of their experiences, and we know that many members of Congress have struggled with trauma from that day. We know that you have. Is it possible, and I know
They're nothing but absolute statists. They're only worried about their power. They're not worried about your constitutional rights.
What you have
They're
dealt
not worried
with
about
personally as
freedom.
the after
They're worried
effects
about power
of
and
that day?
control. Period.
Sure. I mean, initially, I think there was just the experience of the day itself, the level of violence, and for me, in my personal
If
experience,
Democrats
I think
really
it was
wanted to
so
be
difficult to deal
open,
with
honest,
because,
and,
the first time
put
in
the
my law
truth out
enforcement
there,
career, and I work
why
in
did they
narcotics,
hide
so it's to
most
say
of the
that,
footage from January
I've
6th?
experienced a few
Why did
things.
they freak out when
I
that
had
footage
never
got
been
released? Just like
completely,
Tucker Carlson, or a lot of it was put online in some
I
cases.
had lost all control.
Why did they go
of
through
my
and
own survival in
scrub
those moments.
places
And it
like
was
YouTube
only
of that
because
footage?
of a few individuals in the crowd and the efforts of law enforcement that I was able to survive that. And so that level of vulnerability for me as an officer was more.
Yes, if
than,
you're the one I'm thinking about, people in
that I
the
could
crowd after you
in the
escalated
aftermath,
shit,
there was
people in the crowd
criticism
picked you
from,
up,
internal
and
criticism
took
on
you back
behalf
to
of other
police
officers
lines.
in the department that made the experience much more difficult. And then eventually the, mischaracterizations, the lies about what happened that day, lies about me specifically, and who I was.
If all
and
these
what
guys from
role I
January 6th
played,
that were arrested, that were
at
put
the
in
Capitol on
jail,
January
held in jail
6th,
for 2 years, if all of their cases were such
against
demonstrations
myself
of
and members of
insurrection,
my family,
why did they
in a
not go
way,
to
I think it's
trial?
impossible to,
Why were
for
they
me at
given
least, to fully resolve
these
that
fucking plea
trauma
deals they got?
because, even in attending this
Made
hearing
to
today,
sign
I
statements.
received
Why were they
phone
not on trial,
calls.
publicized?
And so, how do you?
Oh, let me see. It would ruin your
How do
narrative.
you resolve that when it's ongoing?
Well, I'm sorry that
I'm
it
in.
happened, and thank you for your courage, and thank you for coming and sharing with us today. I yield back.
Generally, is back. Chair recognizes himself. Mr. Michel, if the government's going to go get information from banks, and understand what happened in this particular situation and other situations, the government goes to the bank and says, I want the name of the customer who's making purchases in a certain date time, and I want the name of the customer who may have bought a firearm at any time. If they're going to do that, do you think they need to get a warrant first?
Do I think they should?
Yes.
Well, yes.
Mr. Tedesco, do you think they need to get a warrant to do that?
Yes.
Mr. Knight?
Yes.
Mr. Peterson?
Yes.
Mr. Fanone, do you think they need to get a warrant?
Could you repeat the question?
Government goes to a bank and says, I want the name of the customer who made purchases on these specific dates and may have bought a firearm at any time. Should there be a warrant requirement before the bank has to be compelled by the government to give that information? Should there be a warrant requirement first?
I mean, in my experience, I always sought voluntary compliance. It's less paperwork. That being said, if I was unable to.
Wait. Voluntary compliance.
Correct.
How's it voluntary? This is the third party. The bank's giving it.
No, if I go to the bank and request certain information regarding an investigation that I'm
I'm
participating
just saying, in a fundamental sense, do you think there should be a warrant requirement before some financial institution hands over the name of the customer based on certain purchases they may have made? So in a general sense,
Yes.
you think there should be?
Yes.
That's great, because your colleagues don't think so. Now, let me go to this. Do you think, Mr. Michel, that if it can't do a warrant, do you think there should be at least a notification? So should at least the bank say, hey, Mr. Smith, the FBI just asked me for all your purchases on a certain date, and they want to know if you've ever bought a gun. Do you think that the bank should at least tell their customer who they're supposed to serve? Do you think they should at least be compelled to tell them that?
Yes.
Mr. Tedesco?
Yes.
Mr. Knight?
Yes, with reasonable exceptions for an ongoing criminal case.
Fair enough. Mr. Peterson?
They should get a warrant.
Let's get a warrant. Back to the first thing. Mr. Falone?
Again, with exceptions for criminal investigation.
We got agreement on the panel. The first time we've had that this morning. Dr. Peterson, I want you to talk about the debanking issue we saw so much of, and how that was, particularly, I guess, with the truckers.
I got about another 5 minutes,
How
and then I
that's,
got to get out of here.
because I see it coming. I see it coming here, and it frightens me. I want you to talk about what took place in Canada and if it in any way impacted you.
Well, there was essentially a working class protest against the extensive length of the COVID lockdowns. And one consequence of that was that Canadians who participated, even by donating to the protest and even by donating small amounts to the protest, had their bank accounts seized in consequence of a collusion between the banks and the government that was extrajudicial, that was recently deemed unconstitutional, despite the fact that we don't have strong First Amendment claims. So this happened. The government is currently maneuvering in Canada to make the possibility of such collusion a certainty across multiple actual and potential domains of so-called harm, particularly in relationship to government-defined hate. Yes, this is absolutely coming, and it's facilitated by the kinds of advancements in technology that we talked about today.
Yeah, We know it's coming because we've seen what do they call it? The liaison information report from the FBI to the bank saying possibly include firearm legislation, the easing of immigration status, new limits on public land, and discontent with renewed measures to mitigate the spread of COVID-19. So the very issue that these truckers were debanked in Canada is the very thing the government is saying to banks. We need to look
Remember,
at
it
this
wasn't
as
just
well.
the truckers;
That
it was
single
people who
issue.
donated to
That
them.
is again what
It was
frightens me so
GoFundMe
much.
shutting
And-
everything down and holding
frankly,
up millions
when
of
you're
dollars
getting
of
this information,
donations.
if you're going to get it, why you should be compelled to get the warrant before you go get it. Mr. Knight, jump right in.
I want to clarify one part of my answer to the second question about notification.
Yep.
The Right to Financial Privacy Act, I think, does a good job of this, where notification can be delayed, but the government has to go to a court and get permission to delay. I think if we're going,
you shift the burden.
Yeah, I mean, and
the burden's where it should be on the government to go get it from a court.
Absolutely, and I do believe that there should be a warrant requirement. So the notification would only be delayed in that event.
In this world we're now in, the full committee, as I said, I think I may have mentioned earlier, on the FISA reauthorization, we've said the same thing. If you're going to go search American citizens based on their phone number, their email address, in this haystack of information that's out there, if you're going to do
Dude,
that,
I'd have to look
go
that
get a
up,
warrant.
Chess.
We're having the same fight there. But it seems to me that getting a
I have
warrant,
to do a little
Fourth
research on
Amendment, constitutional right, is how it has to be handled. My time has expired. I yield to the ranking member.
Thank you very much. I thought it was very telling that Mr. Knight said that, yes, going after bank records would be inappropriate, except in a criminal investigation. Ooh, criminal investigation. That's what the FBI was doing, was involved in a criminal
You have to
investigation.
be charging someone
No,
with a
not with a
crime
warrant. It's
and
not
then
necessary to
investigating
have
the
a warrant.
crime,
Go back to
not getting
criminal
blanket
procedure.
information
You
for
don't
every
always need a
new
warrant when you
customer.
have voluntary authorization. And everyone who opens a bank account is told when they open their bank account that the information may be disclosed to law enforcement. Now, if we want to change that rule in the consumer protection laws, then we need to do that. But until that, they have a reasonable expectation that law enforcement may disclose that information. Because once you are banking with a banking institution, that information in that record belongs to the banking institution. It doesn't solely belong to you anymore.
And she is
when you are
completely
using a
fine with the
bank
government
in that
having
banking
access to
institution.
every
And
part
they
of
have
your
given
life.
disclosure. Now, if we want to make it an affirmative disclosure where an individual has to specifically check off the box that allows them to be aware of it when they're opening a bank, then that's something else. But you do not need a warrant. You can have voluntary disclosure because under our law presently, the banks have possession and ownership of that information. Now, the other thing that I think you have talked about is, are we worried about that? That this is only going to happen to the on conservatives? No, I'm also concerned if the FBI were to do overreach. I am concerned with that. And I do understand that this is something that law enforcement does and that we need to be careful about what they do.
Washington
I just
Post.
find it very interesting that you all are my colleagues. One of our witnesses, Mr. Fanon, is not a colleague of
I'm gonna have to
ours.
see. I'm gonna have
Is
to look
giving
and
his
see whether I can
opinion
find it somewhere
as a
else
law
because
enforcement officer. Sir, was there
I'm
something
not
else that
supporting
you
the
wanted to
Washington
add?
Post and paying for their damn
Within the
subscription.
context of this particular investigation, one of the reasons why I believe that the FBI would have sought voluntary compliance as opposed to applying for a warrant is the
All right, well, I'll
sheer
tell you what, guys. I got to
magnitude
shut this down. I got to get out of here. I'm
the
kind of pushing my
event.
time so I can
You
get to
had
work.
literally thousands of people who participated.
So, I mean, you know where all these people stand. They're perfectly fine with the government having access to all of your records at any time. And instead of you actually having to be, I don't know, accused of a crime, them to go to a grand jury and actually charge you with a crime, they're perfectly fine just digging all the way through your life. And that's insane. It honestly is. Yeah, Chess, I'll look into it more. Because I've looked at a lot of cases out of Jan 6 and they were just absolutely insane what these people were being charged with, and their the sentences that the government wanted them to get. It was all a pressure campaign to say we're going to put you in jail for decades unless you sign this deal, unless you admit to this, and unless you help us push our narrative. Basically, we're going to destroy your life. That's what they did. So, but anyway, guys, let me get out of here. All you guys that showed up today, love all you guys muches. Y'all be cool, y'all perps. Keep that thing on you at all times. We'll probably catch you guys tonight. Either I'll stream it myself, or if Rich streams, maybe I'll be on his stream. Maybe I'll just be in the chat. And yeah, we'll see what Uncle Sniffy's got to say tonight. So other than that, let my happy ass get to work. You guys take it easy. Be cool. Have a great rest of the day. And hey, just remember, your government hates you. You guys take them easy, man. I am out.